If you pull up almost any European map of the world printed between, say, 1400 and 1800, you'll find something strange. Spread across the vast interior of Asia, covering an area larger than any empire you learned about in school, is a name. Sometimes written in sweeping italic letters across grasslands and deserts that stretch from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific. Sometimes tucked into the margins of oceans the cartographers barely understood. The name is Tartary, or Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, or Chinese Tartary, or Independent Tartary. It shifts slightly depending on the century and the language, but it never quite disappears. It just sits there on map after map after map, like a word someone keeps writing in the margins of history. And here's the thing, most people today have never heard of it. It doesn't appear in the national anthems of any modern country. There are no official borders, no capital city, no famous founding rulers on currency. It just vanishes from the maps sometime in the 1800s, and the world moves on as if it was never there. So what was it? Where did it come from? Why did educated European cartographers, scholars and encyclopedists keep using this word for 4 centuries? And why, in the last decade or so, has it come roaring back into conversation? But this time, wrapped in theories about hidden civilizations, erased empires, and a history that someone allegedly doesn't want you to know. That last question is what brought a lot of you here, and that's completely fine. Curiosity is the right instinct. The mistake would be to either accept the wilder theories without question, or to dismiss the whole thing so quickly that you miss the genuinely fascinating history buried underneath. Because there is real history here. Deep, strange, complicated history. The kind that involves the actual limits of what European scholars knew about Asia. The fear that rippled across a continent when Mongol armies appeared on the horizon. The slow and messy business of empires absorbing one another, and the way names on maps can outlive the realities that created them by centuries. So that's what this is, not a debunking, not a conspiracy deep dive, something closer to an excavation. We're going to dig into the actual sources, the maps, the travelogues written by monks and merchants who travelled east on roads they barely understood, the encyclopedias that tried to organise a world that kept refusing to hold still, the imperial records from Muscovy and Beijing, and the steppe khanates in between. We're going to follow the word Tartary, the way a linguist follows a river upstream through centuries, watching it narrow and fork, and eventually find its source. And by the time we're done, you'll understand not just what Tartary was, but why it's so easy to misread, and why misreading it is actually kind of understandable when you see how genuinely strange and uncertain the record really is. The journey will take us across most of Eurasia. We'll move from medieval European panic about Mongol horsemen to the patient cartographic work of scholars who were essentially trying to draw a map of a continent they'd mostly never visited. We'll watch Russia slowly expand eastward across the steppe until the lands that once appeared on European maps as unknowable wilderness became provinces, then railroads, then cities. We'll see how empires collide in Central Asia, and how a single convenient label got stretched to cover realities so different from one another that using one word for all of them tells you more about the limits of the person labelling than the thing being labelled. And somewhere in all of that, the modern legend will start to make more sense, not because it's accurate, but because you'll be able to see exactly which gaps in the historical record it slipped through. But that's later. Right now, it's late, or early, or somewhere in the long quiet hours in between, and you're listening, and that's exactly the right way to approach this story. Tartary is not a history that rewards rushing. It's a history that opens up slowly, the way a landscape does when you're moving through it at the pace of a traveller on horseback rather than a plane. So let it unfold, let your breathing slow down. There's no exam at the end of this. Just a very long, very strange journey across a continent, full of names that meant different things to different people at different moments in time. Where are you right now? I genuinely want to know. drop it in the comments. Not just the place, the time too. Because one of the things this channel does is collect those little data points from all over the world, and the result is something that feels a little like what Tartary itself once was. A vast spread of different places that somehow all belong to the same thing. Someone in Mumbai at 2 in the morning, someone in Toronto just getting into bed, someone in Glasgow who turned this on during a commute and hasn't stopped listening. If you're one of those people, say hello. Say where you are and what time it is. Those comments are some of my favourite things about making this. And if you're listening on Spotify, or you want to, there's a link in the description to follow the show there. No ads, no music layered underneath. Just the words, clean and uninterrupted. It's the best way to listen if you're using this to sleep, which, let's be honest, is probably why a lot of you are here. And following on Spotify genuinely does help more than you might think. So if you haven't done it yet, it takes about 4 seconds and the link is right there. Now, back to that name on the map. What's remarkable about Tartary isn't just that it existed, it's how long it persisted and how confident the maps look when they write it. There's no hedging in the cartography, no question mark after the letters. Whoever drew these maps wrote Tartaria across those grasslands and mountain ranges with the same calm authority they used for France or Persia or the Ottoman Empire. As if it were equally real, equally defined, equally understood. But when you start reading the texts that accompanied those maps, the encyclopedias and the travel accounts and the geographical dictionaries, a slightly different picture starts to emerge. Something more uncertain, more approximate, more honest, in a way about how little anyone in London or Amsterdam or Paris actually knew about what was happening in the interior of Asia at any given moment. That gap between the confidence of the cartographic label and the uncertainty of the underlying knowledge is really the heart of this whole story. It's where the history gets genuinely interesting, and it's also, not coincidentally, where the modern legend finds its footing. Because when there are gaps in the official record, when scholars admit they don't fully know what's out there, that's when the imagination rushes in to fill the space. Sometimes the imagination gets it roughly right. Sometimes it goes somewhere much wilder. And with Tartary, it has gone very wild indeed in recent years. But here's the thing about filling gaps with imagination. It works a lot better when you understand the shape of the gap first. When you know why the gap exists, what created it, how wide it really is, and what the actual historical evidence on either side of it looks like. That's what separates a theory that's worth taking seriously from one that collapses the moment you read a single primary source. So that's what we're going to build, not a wall against curiosity, but a foundation for it, a sense of what was actually known, actually recorded, actually happening in the lands that Europeans labelled Tartary for 400 years, so that when we eventually get to the modern legend, you'll have something real to measure it against. It starts, as most strange histories do, long before anyone drew the map. It starts with fear and distance and a name that arrived in Europe like a shockwave. And that story begins not with cartographers, but with the moment Europe first heard hoofbeats from the east and realised it had no idea what was coming. Before there was Tartary on those maps, there was something else. A patchwork, a collection of inherited labels borrowed from dead empires and half-understood classical texts, stitched together into something that looked like geographical knowledge, but was really more like geographical faith. European scholars in the early medieval period had a map of Asia in their heads, and it was built almost entirely from things people had written down centuries, sometimes millennia before they were born. The starting point was the Greeks. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, had described the lands north of the Black Sea as Scythia, a broad, flat, enormous territory filled with nomadic horsemen who drank from the skulls of their enemies and were basically impossible to conquer because they had no cities to attack and no fixed territory to defend. For Herodotus, Scythia was the edge of the knowable world, the place where the roads ran out and the wind took over. And that framing, that sense of a vast northern interior beyond the reach of civilization, lodged itself in European thinking so deeply that it was still shaping how scholars talked about Asia more than 1500 years later. When medieval European writers needed a word for the grasslands and the nomads who moved across them, they reached back for Scythia, sometimes directly, sometimes mixed with newer names, but always with that same sense of a place that resisted being pinned down. Then there was Cathay. The word comes through a Turkic root from the Khitan, a people who had ruled in northern China and whose name filtered westward along the trade routes in various forms until it became, for European writers and merchants, the standard shorthand for the Chinese civilization they could barely glimpse through layers of intermediaries. Marco Polo used it. So did the Franciscan monks who travelled east in the 13th century, with papal letters tucked into their robes and instructions to find the Mongol leaders and convert them, or at least negotiate with them. Cathay meant, roughly, the civilization to the east, the place of silk and sophisticated things, the opposite of steppe in almost every way, and yet, crucially, it was just as vaguely located. You knew it was east, you knew it was wealthy. Where exactly it ended, where the steppe began, what lay between them, those were questions that nobody could answer precisely because nobody had made the journey with a ruler and a compass. India was even more elastic. To medieval European writers, India could mean the actual subcontinent, but it could also mean virtually anything south and east of Persia. There was India the Greater, India the Lesser, and Farther India, a kind of geographical overflow category for places that clearly existed, but didn't fit anywhere else on the mental map. When the earliest European accounts of what we now call Southeast Asia arrived, they were often filed under India. When Ethiopia appeared in European texts, it was sometimes placed adjacent to India or tangled up with it. The word had become less a location and more a direction, a gesture toward the unknown southeast, which is a remarkable thing for a place name to do. What produced this vagueness wasn't stupidity. It was the nature of the information available. Most of what medieval European scholars knew about Asia came through chains of transmission so long that each link introduced new distortions. An Arabic geographer might have drawn on Persian sources who had read Greek texts translated through Syriac, and then a European scholar would translate the Arabic into Latin and add their own classical references and misreadings, and by the end of that process, the information on the page was carrying several centuries of accumulated guesswork, each generation's mistakes layered over the previous ones. The steppe itself made this worse. Grasslands don't produce the kind of material culture that generates written records. No great stone cities, no archives, no libraries. The people who knew the steppe best, the people who actually lived on it, the Turkic and Mongolic and Iranian nomadic groups who had been moving across it for millennia, they transmitted their knowledge through oral tradition, through genealogies and songs, and the accumulated practical wisdom of how to find water and read weather and navigate by landmarks that didn't appear on any map. That knowledge was profound. It just didn't travel well through the channels European scholars had access to. The geography itself pushed back against easy labelling. The Eurasian steppe is not one thing. It's a series of grass-covered corridors interrupted by mountains and rivers and deserts that create natural boundaries but not impermeable ones. The Volga flows south into the Caspian. The Oxus winds through territory that shifts between steppe and desert depending on the season. The Altai Mountains divide the western grasslands from the eastern ones, but they're permeable enough that people and animals and languages and goods have been crossing them for thousands of years. Drawing a line and saying this is where one civilization ends and another begins is something the geography actively refuses to cooperate with. The caravan routes that knitted Eurasia together followed logic that had nothing to do with the ethnic or political categories European mapmakers were trying to impose. A merchant moving silk from Xi'an toward Constantinople passed through so many different political territories, linguistic zones and cultural worlds that calling any of it by a single name was always an act of oversimplification. The broad ethnonyms, those sweeping labels that named whole populations with a single word, were the most powerful and most distorting tools of all. Scythians, Tartars, Turks, in reality these words pointed toward enormous diversity. Dozens of distinct peoples with different languages, different political structures, different relationships to the land. But from a distance, from the vantage point of someone sitting in a monastery in France or a counting house in Venice, a nomadic horseman was a nomadic horseman, and the word that named the most frightening one you'd heard about lately tended to become the word that named all of them. There's nothing malicious in that. It's just how the human mind handles information. It doesn't have the tools to categorize properly. You reach for the nearest label. You make it do more work than it should. And then, over time, the label starts to feel like a reality, like something that was always there, when in fact it was always just a shortcut your ancestors took because the world was bigger than their maps. And it was about to get dramatically, terrifyingly bigger. Because somewhere to the east, moving faster than news could travel, something was coming that would force Europe to find a new word entirely. The new word arrived on horseback. In the 1220s and 1230s, armies that nobody in Europe had a name for came boiling out of those vague northern lands that used to be called Scythia. They moved with a speed that didn't make sense to people used to siege warfare and seasonal campaigns. These riders could cover 100 kilometers in a day, disappear into the horizon, then reappear a week later somewhere no one thought they could reach. They carried composite bows that could punch through armour at distances European archers would have considered fantasy. They had engineers who could throw stones with trebuchets and also swim rivers in winter by using their horses as flotation devices. And above all, they had a plan. We call them Mongols now, because that's how they eventually named themselves to the outside world, the people of Genghis Khan, drawn from the tribes of the Mongol steppe. But that is not the word most Europeans first heard. What filtered westward along shattered trade routes and through terrified survivors was something closer to tatar, sometimes Tartar. In Russian and Turkic usage, that word already existed as an ethnonym for certain steppe peoples to the north and east, some of whom had been incorporated into the Mongol war machine. To neighbours closer to the action, Tatars were a recognisable group with their own lineage and politics. They were one component in a much larger shifting mosaic of steppe tribes. But news does not travel with footnotes. When the first major Mongol incursions crashed into the kingdoms of Rus, the chroniclers in those wooden towns heard local names shouted in battle, heard prisoners describe who had attacked them, heard their own princes mutter old ethnonyms in confusion and fear. They fastened on the one they half recognized, Tatars. In Latinized form, Tartary. From their perspective it made sense. The forces that burned Ryazan and smashed Kiev contained Tatars. Some of the commanders were Tatars. Early Mongol coalition forces had even fought enemies called Tatars before Chinggis rose to power. The name was around, attached to dangerous horsemen. So when the shock hit, the most frightening label at hand rose to the top again. It became once more the word that did too much work. Within a few years, that label met an older piece of European mental furniture and fused with it in a way nobody could have planned. Latin-educated clerics knew their classical texts, or at least pieces of them. They knew about Tartarus, the deep pit beneath Hades, where the worst offenders in Greek myth were punished. A place lower than death, reserved for the enemies of the gods. For minds steeped in that tradition, the resemblance between Tartarus and Tartar wasn't just a coincidence in sound, it was an interpretive invitation. Here were horsemen who seemed to come out of nowhere, who annihilated cities, who killed princes and peasants without distinction, who sent refugee streams crawling westward, full of stories about pyramids of skulls and fields, where nothing green grew anymore. How could this not be a scourge from beneath the earth, a punishment sent by God, or perhaps permitted by him, but rising from something older and darker. So, in Latin chronicles, the word shifts. You see phrases like Tartary, quasi de Tartaro exorti, the Tartars, as if sprung from Tartarus. The etymology is wrong, but it is powerful. It makes rhetorical and theological sense. It places the incomprehensible Mongol advance into a familiar cosmology. These are not just enemies. They are eschatological signs, markers that the world is entering a final, terrifying phase. And once that link is made, it sticks. Copyists reproduce it. Preachers use it. A monk in France, copying a chronicle from Germany that was itself based on reports from Hungary, writes Tartar with an extra R and a little gloss in the margin connecting them to the pit of hell. A generation later, someone copying that manuscript may not remember that the link was originally a clever turn of phrase, an exegetical flourish. They see it as etymological fact. Tartars come from Tartarus. Of course they do. Everybody knows that. Meanwhile, the people actually doing the conquering have their own words. Mongol envoys who reached the courts of Europe in the mid-13th century identify themselves as servants of the great Khan, rulers of the Mongol Ulus. They carry letters demanding submission, written in languages most Europeans cannot read, sealed with titles and names that do not map neatly onto the scare word that is circulating in Latin and French and German accounts. A few particularly careful observers get the distinction. Some friars who travel to the Mongol court note that Mongol is a self-designation, while Tatar seems more regional, more tribal. But again, distance and fear smooth away nuance. For most Europeans, what matters is not the internal structure of the Mongol Empire. What matters is the memory of towns burned, armies destroyed, populations enslaved. The composite word Tartar, with its echo of Tartarus, fits the emotional reality better than Mongol, which still sounds foreign, untranslated, not yet settled into the language. So Tartar hardens. It becomes a default label in chronicles even when writers kind of know it's not technically precise. A writer may mention the people who call themselves Mongols, whom we call Tartars, but once you frame them as Tartars, sprung from the infernal pit, you tend to see everything they do through that lens. Their victories confirm their monstrous reputation. Their occasional diplomatic overtures look like cunning tricks. Their religious tolerance, which in some periods really did allow for a bewildering variety of faiths under Mongol rule, barely registers. The name itself is doing the interpretive work, and names like that are sticky. They are efficient when a scribe 100 years later needs to sum up the peoples beyond the Russes' lands, beyond the Carpathians, beyond the black loam fields where settled agriculture still makes sense to him. He reaches back for the established term, Tartars. The exact political situation might be different. The unified Mongol Empire is long gone. Power on the steppe has fragmented into khanates that fight each other as often as they ride out against neighbours. But on the page, the label persists. By the time European map makers begin to put more detailed names north of the Black Sea and east of Muscovy, that chronicler's word has solidified into a cartographic habit. You see Tartaria used as a broad regional term, the lands of the Tartars. It's a translation of an interpretation of an overheard ethnonym filtered through a theological pun, then generalized across centuries of copying. Few of the people writing it onto maps have met anyone who calls themselves a Tatar, much less a Mongol. Fewer still have wrestled with the fact that Tatar is, even at its most accurate, just one of many steppe identities. But the shape of the fear that crystallized in the 13th century is still there in the ink. Tartaria evokes not just a place, but a mood, distant, dangerous, morally ambiguous. A region associated in the European imagination, with sudden invasions, overwhelming cavalry, and empires that rose and fell faster than news of their rise and fall could reach Paris or Florence. The irony is that by the time Tartary becomes a standard feature of European maps, the Mongol shock that created the fear behind the word is already receding into legend. Later generations inherit the label without the experience that made it feel so urgent. They see Tartary as a convenient bucket into which you can toss almost any unfamiliar people from the great northern interior. And once a label is that useful, it tends to survive long after the realities it originally described have shifted beyond recognition. The next step is almost inevitable. If Tatar can name any frightening horseman from the east, Tartaria can name the land they come from, no matter how complex and varied that land actually is. The chronicler's fear word moves from the margins of manuscripts to the centres of maps, and with that move a whole new cartographic ghost is born. By the time Tartaria is regularly inked onto European maps, something subtle has happened. The word has slipped its original moorings. It's no longer just a label from frightened chronicles. It has become a tool of the trade. Think about the job of an early modern mapmaker for a moment. You are sitting at a desk in Amsterdam or Venice or Nuremberg. You have never been to the Caspian Sea. You have never felt the winter wind on the Kazakh steppe or tried to breathe the thin air of the Tian Shan. What you have are scraps. Travellers' reports, old Portolan charts, bits of ancient geography, rumours from merchants, notes from missionaries, letters from diplomats, and other people's maps. You have to turn that uneven pile into something that looks like a coherent world. For coastlines, this is easier. Sailors bring back fairly precise information. You can measure latitude with an astrolabe. You can triangulate harbours. Over a few generations, the outlines of continents start to settle into something like their real shapes. But the interiors are another matter. Beyond the well-travelled river valleys and caravan routes, the world dissolves into hearsay. Someone has heard that beyond this forest, there is a vast plain. Someone else insists that there are mountains there, or a salty sea, or a kingdom ruled by a priest-king. You do not have the luxury of leaving these spaces blank, because people buying maps do not like emptiness. They want the whole earth on a single sheet, explained and bounded and named. So cartographers develop a habit. When you don't know the details of an interior, you give it a broad umbrella label. You turn uncertainty into a region. On some maps, you can see this most clearly in Africa and the Americas. Huge territories called simply Ethiopia, or Guyana, or Florida, stretched far beyond any precise knowledge. In northern Asia, the catch-all term is Tartaria. Once you see it this way, the shape of the word changes. Tartaria is less like France or Persia, and more like writing a lot of different peoples live somewhere around here. To a European armchair geographer in 1550, this actually feels quite reasonable. They know in a hazy way that beyond Muscovy and the Black Sea there are grasslands and forests and deserts. They know that nomadic groups roam there, some paying tribute to distant khans, others raiding their neighbours, others trading furs and horses and slaves. They know the most terrifying horsemen of their grandparents' stories came from those directions. They know those horsemen were called Tartars. It is a short step from that mental picture to shading an enormous swath of paper and writing across it, in large letters, Tartaria. Underneath that banner, early modern mapmakers begin to add subdivisions. This is where you can see the compromise between ignorance and the pressure to look informed. One of the most common distinctions is Great Tartary. This usually sprawls across Siberia and Central Asia, from somewhere east of the Volga all the way to the Pacific. Great here does not mean powerful state. It means the really big, vague part. The lands of many nomadic groups, many languages, many little khanates and clans, all blurred together under one grand, slightly ominous term. Then there is Muscovite Tartary, draped over regions north and east of the core Russian principalities. This label quietly acknowledges that the Tsars of Moscow are extending their authority over some of the steppe and forest peoples once thought of as purely Tartar. It says, these are still Tartars, but now they belong, at least on paper, to the Muscovite sphere. Further east and south, as reports drift in from Jesuits and merchants at the fringes of the Ming and later Qing empires, you begin to see Chinese Tartary. This doesn't mean a separate polity ruled from some hidden Tartar capital. It means those northern frontier regions that Chinese emperors claim full of people we also think of as Tartars. Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, all of them can be swept under Chinese Tartary, depending on the mapmaker, the date, and which traveller's account he read last. And in some atlases, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, you find yet another label, Independent Tartary. This tends to sit somewhere around the Central Asian khanates, Bukhara, Khiva, Kokand, places that are known, in outline, to have their own rulers and cities, but that don't fit neatly under Russian or Chinese control. Calling them independent is less a precise constitutional statement and more a way of saying they are Tartars but not obviously anybody's subjects yet. None of these subdivisions corresponds cleanly to how people on the ground think of themselves. A Kazakh herder does not wake up in Great Tartary. A Bukharan scholar does not write poetry about independent Tartary. A Manchu bannerman riding along the Great Wall does not swear allegiance to Chinese Tartary. These are mapmakers' categories. They are ways of slicing uncertainty into saleable chunks. If you look more closely at those old maps, you can see that the people drawing them know, at some level, how approximate their knowledge is. The uncertainty leaks out at the edges. There are the little notes in cramped italic script. Hic sunt populi vagantes. Here are wandering peoples. The country of the Kalmuk Tartars little known. Desert of sand said to be impassable. Here dwell many nations of Tartars, of whose manners little is related. There are the ornaments, elaborate cartouches framing the word Tartaria, with images of horsemen in furs, camels, tents, occasionally monsters. These are not observational sketches from life. They are a kind of visual shorthand for exotic interior. When you lack specifics, you decorate. Even the rivers and mountains in these regions give the game away. Some are reasonably well placed, following the reports of traders and envoys. Others meander in impossible loops, join and separate in ways that make no hydrological sense, or run straight from one ocean to another because someone misread a previous map. Peaks rise where someone, decades earlier, had guessed there must be a mountain range to balance the composition, and nobody has yet had a reason to erase it. All of this sits under the calming, authoritative label, Tartaria, and behind that label is a very practical business model. Early modern mapmaking is not a pure scholarly enterprise. It is a commercial craft. Workshops invest serious time and money in engraving plates, printing sheets, colouring them, binding them into atlases. Once you have a good copperplate of Eurasia, you don't throw it away lightly. You update it. A new traveller comes back from Persia and says the Caspian is longer north-south than east-west. You adjust the shoreline on your next state of the plate. A Russian embassy sends a sketch suggesting that their frontier forts now reach further down the Volga. You extend the Muscovy label and maybe shrink Great Tartary a little on the western edge. A Jesuit map of China circulates in Europe with different province names. You add Chinese Tartary above them to tie your work into theirs. But you rarely question the big, convenient words printed in large type across the middle of the unknowns. Those are inherited from previous generations of mapmakers, who inherited them from chroniclers, who inherited them from terrified witnesses. They are by now part of the furniture of the world. So Tartaria persists, not because every new cartographer goes out and carefully verifies the existence of a single vast Tartar empire, but because the label solves a problem. It lets you fill a space on the page. It lets you sound informed without having to specify every tribe and town and khanate. It ties your map into a chain of earlier works that buyers already trust. In other words, Tartary is a convenience, a shorthand, a habit. Over time, the repetition of that habit starts to do something strange. What began as a way to gesture at ignorance starts to look, to later eyes, like a statement of fact. Many different maps across many decades all show Tartaria in roughly the same place. The subdivisions shift, the borders wobble, but the word itself feels stable. From the point of view of someone living centuries later, leafing through reproductions online, that stability can be misleading. It can be tempting to think if they wrote Tartary on so many maps, it must have been a real empire. It must have been a coherent state, with borders and a capital and a flag, somehow wiped from memory. What gets lost in that temptation is the work those mapmakers were actually doing. They were not secretly recording a hidden civilization. They were making the best of partial information with the tools, linguistic, theological, cartographic, that they had, and on their desks, surrounded by half-remembered chronicles and copied coastal outlines, Tartaria was less a mystery than a placeholder. A way of saying, beyond this point, there are people and stories we do not yet know how to name. If you peel that placeholder label off the map for a moment and look at the land underneath, the picture becomes both clearer and stranger. Because in the real world, Tartary did not point to a secret lost country. It pointed to a sweep of territory so large and so internally varied that no single word could ever capture it. Start in the west where Europe's hazy knowledge began to fray. Cross the forests and fields of Muscovy. Follow the Volga River upstream, and you arrive at the Volga-Ural region. To an armchair geographer, this is already Tatar country. Here lived Volga Tatars, Bashkirs, Nogais, Chuvash, Mari, Udmurts, Turkic and Finno-Ugric peoples mixed together over centuries of migration, conversion, war and alliance. Some of these groups had accepted Islam, others practiced forms of Christianity. Others still kept older, local religious traditions alive under thin new veneers. They paid tribute to Moscow or to a local Khan or to both, depending on the year. Their elites might speak several languages and keep legal codes that blended steppe custom with Islamic jurisprudence and Russian decrees. To a European mapmaker, none of that complexity was visible. What filtered through was a much simpler story. These are Tatars beyond Muscovy. On the plate, they became Muscovite Tartary. Keep drifting east. Once you have crossed the Urals, the low, forested ridgeline that Europeans like to treat as the border between their continent and Asia, you spill out into a different world entirely. This is Siberia. On maps, Siberia, under the Tartary label, looks like a blank swath of land with a few rivers traced onto it. In reality, it was threaded with peoples whose lives followed those rivers like veins. Along the Ob, Yenisei and Lena, you would find Khanty and Mansi hunters, Nenets, reindeer herders, Efenki, and even reindeer and horse peoples, Yakuts, raising hardy cattle in astonishing cold, small groups whose names barely survived in Russian reports. Some spoke Turkic languages, some Uralic, some Tungusic, some unique isolates. Many lived in small bands moving with the seasons, not in walled cities with census rolls. To the Tsars who gradually pushed in from the west, Siberia was not a single country to conquer. It was a network of fur-producing communities to tax. Expeditions arrived at a river bend, demanded tribute in sable and other pelts, built a fort, and then wrote home, "The people here are such and such tribe, paying yasak." The next expedition farther upstream might meet people with different names, different customs, but they too would be summarized under the same broad impression, northern tribes, paying fur tax. European mapmakers reading those reports saw the tributaries but not the texture. They took this wide river-bound web of communities and phrase it as Great Tartary, subject in part to the Tsar. Further south, the land shifts again. Between the Volga forests and the Altai mountains, the temperate steppe opens out. Kazakhstan today and adjacent regions. On a satellite image, it looks like unbroken grass. On the ground, it has always been a living mosaic of roots, wells, wintering valleys, and summer pastures. This is where some of the classic steppe confederations formed, the loose, shifting alliances that terrified settled empires and confused their chroniclers. Unlike the centralized states Europeans were used to, steppe polities did not always have fixed capitals or clear borders. A Khan's authority might rest on his charisma, his lineage, his share of plunder, and his ability to keep key clans loyal. When he was strong, messengers could ride from the Volga to the Tartaria, from the Altai to the Caspian, collecting tribute in horses, sheep, and slaves. When he was weak, his empire might dissolve in a season. The Golden Horde, the Nogai Horde, the Uzbek confederations, the Kazakh Juzes, the Dzungar Khanate, their names echo through specialist histories. But on many European maps, they were melted down into Tatars. A success of one Khan might be mapped as the advance of Tartary. A collapse might be represented by nothing at all, because the underlying term remained the same. From the perspective of the people living there, allegiance could be intensely specific. You belong to a certain clan, under a certain sultan, owing certain obligations to a particular Khan this year. From the perspective of someone in Venice reading a Persian geography 20 years out of date, you lived in the land of the Tatars, famed horsemen of the north. Keep moving east and a little south, and the plain breaks into more dramatic geography. The Tian Shan and Pamir ranges rise up, and with them a chain of irrigated oases, the cities of Central Asia. Khiva along the Amu Darya, Bukhara and Samarkand, nourishing vineyards and orchards behind their walls, coconed in the fertile Fergana Valley. Here, power looked more familiar to European eyes. Urban centres with madrasas and markets, dynasties with coinage and written chronicles, Sufi orders sponsoring poetry and architecture. Yet even these khanates were deeply entangled with the steppe beyond their walls. Their rulers married into nomadic lineages, hired steppe warriors as mercenaries, taxed caravans that passed through from one horizon to another. On some maps, these pockets of urban authority were dignified with their own names, Busharia, Chiva, Samarkand. On others they disappeared into independent Tartary, an in-between label that nodded at their autonomy while still placing them inside the great northern blur. Beyond them lay Mongolia. For Europeans raised on tales of Genghis Khan, this region was the mythic heart of their Tatar story. In the 13th century, Mongol cavalry had indeed exploded outward from these plateaus, stitching together a Eurasian empire with terrifying speed. But by the time Tartary is common on printed maps, that empire is centuries gone. What remained were various Mongol groups, Oirats, Halka, others, balancing between larger neighbours. Some pledged allegiance to the emerging Qing dynasty in China. Others courted Russian traders and envoys. Internal rivalries, religious movements, and foreign intrigues constantly shifted the map in ways that only specialists on the ground really understood. To a geographer in Paris looking at a Jesuit sketch, it was simpler to write Mongol Tartary. Keep going yet further east, and you reach the forests and river valleys of Manchuria, and south of that, the northern frontiers of China proper. On European maps, this is where Chinese Tartary often appears, a band north and west of the Great Wall, covering Manchuria, Mongolia, and sometimes Xinjiang. In the real world, these were frontier zones of the Ming and then Qing empires, governed by complex systems of banners, garrisons, tributary princes, and indirect rule. The Manchus themselves, who would conquer Beijing in the 17th century and found the Qing, were lumped in as yet another kind of Tatar in early European texts. Their own identity, institutions and language were quite distinct, but from a distance they blended into the familiar silhouette, horse-riding northern warriors threatening a settled agrarian state. From there, still under the reach of Tartary on some maps, you could stretch all the way to the Pacific, the Amur Basin, the shores of the Okhotsk Sea, the fringes of what is now the Russian Far East. Places where small Tungusic and other groups fished, hunted sea mammals, and navigated immense rivers that almost never appeared correctly on European plates. So when we talk about what Tartary covered, we are really talking about this whole arc, from the Volga-Ural crossroads, across the Siberian taiga, through the Kazakh steppe and Central Asian oases, past the Mongol plateaus, all the way to Manchuria and the far eastern rivers. An enormous zone where languages, religions and political structures shifted every few hundred miles, but where, to outsiders, certain common patterns stood out. Horses, nomadism, distance from the sea. Those last three words matter for understanding the maps, because if you trace the lines of certainty on early modern atlases, you see that they cling to water. Coastal empires, Portugal along Africa and India, Spain in the Americas, the Dutch and the English around the world, left behind dense, precise coastal outlines, because that was where they sailed, measured and fought. Harbours were surveyed, channels were sounded, bays and capes were named and renamed. Rivers that connected to those coasts were mapped more accurately too, at least in their lower reaches. The Volga down to Astrakhan, the Amur where it meets the sea, the great Chinese rivers where European ships could anchor within range of an imperial port. Inland, the picture degrades fast. Information had to travel overland, along caravan routes and postal relays. Merchants and envoys knew exactly how long it took to get from one market town to another, but they measured it in days of riding, not in latitudes and longitudes. Their mental maps were topological, a chain of places linked by practical journeys, not precise coordinates. For Central Eurasia, the true skeleton of space was not national borders. It was those routes and the rivers that sustained them. Caravans moved from Khiva to Bukhara to Samarkand to Kashgar to Lanzhou, from Astrakhan up the Volga and across portages to the Ob, from Orenburg across the Kazakh steppe to Tashkent, from Beijing north to Urga and west to the Altai. Goods, people and ideas pulsed along those paths. Silk, furs, tea, horses, slaves, manuscripts, rumours. Local people organised their lives around those arteries. Tribes camped near reliable water and pasture along them. Khans fought to control key choke points. Cities thrived where several routes intersected. But when this web of travel was translated into European atlases, most of its complexity vanished. A few town names survived, sometimes detached from their real neighbours by hundreds of miles on the plate. The trade routes themselves became faint dotted lines or decorative suggestions. The rivers remained, but their sources and courses were often guessed at. What stayed bold was the big umbrella word. Tartaria was, in that sense, what you saw when you tried to look at a river and route world through a coastal lens. Wherever European interests planted ports, knowledge thickened. Where they did not, an ocean of land could be wrapped in one convenient term and set aside. The people who lived there still traded, raided, farmed, prayed, argued, wrote poetry, negotiated treaties and raised children. They still built khanates, joined and left confederations, swore oaths and broke them. But on maps in Amsterdam and Paris, their shifting affiliations were smoothed over. They became part of a static expanse: Great Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, a handful of thin labels across a continent-wide diversity. Later, when those labels disappeared and more precise names took their place, Siberia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Manchuria, Xinjiang, it could seem to someone looking backwards as if something enormous had been erased. as if a single realm had once existed and then been dismantled. In reality, the direction of change was almost the opposite. The old term had bundled many worlds together. The newer geography, informed by better surveys and more direct contact, slowly unbundled them. It started to draw the skeleton of that interior, not as a single imagined empire, but as a lattice of rivers, routes, and overlapping political projects that had always been there beneath the word. And it was along those routes, through the same corridors, once buried under Tartary, that the next wave would come: more travellers, more treaties, more survey parties, and finally the empires that would claim to absorb the steppe into their own neat borders. If you were a map-maker in Amsterdam or Paris in the 17th century, you were not out there on the Kazakh steppe counting wells and measuring pastures. You were at a desk. What you had, instead of direct experience, were piles of paper and fragments of memory. Merchant letters, missionary reports, diplomatic dispatches copied and recopied, translations of travelogues that had started life in Persian or Italian or Latin or Russian. Out of those layered, imperfect testimonies, Tartary took on flesh. Think of the kinds of people who reached Europe from that interior world. Italian merchants like Marco Polo and his less famous cousins, who followed Mongol-controlled caravan routes and then dictated their adventures in prison or old age. Franciscan and Dominican friars sent east to preach to the Mongols, or at least to find out whether they were plausible allies against Muslim powers. Envoys of the Pope and of European kings, trying to read the winds of a world where rumours of invasion could cross continents faster than clarifications. Later, Jesuit missionaries reporting from Beijing and the Qing frontiers. Russian officials writing about their expansion along the Siberian rivers. Muslim geographers whose works were translated, condensed, and filtered through several languages before reaching a European readership. All of them saw something. None of them saw everything. Even the most conscientious traveller had a narrow, time-bound view. He, and it was almost always he in these texts, moved along particular routes during particular years, meeting certain elites, relying on certain guides. His experiences passed through multiple interpreters: the man leading his camel, the court translator at a Khan's reception, the scribe who tidied up his notes, the editor who cut out the boring parts for a paying audience. By the time his story reached a print shop, it was not pure observation. It was something shaped by memory, by expectation, by what readers wanted to hear. Still, for Europeans trying to imagine Tartary, these were gold. Certain themes repeated so often that they hardened into clichés. Vast distances. Travellers marvelled at the days and weeks it took to cross a single province, the way horizons seemed to recede forever. They measured space in the number of horse changes at postal stations, or the number of days between reliable wells. To readers used to compact kingdoms, these descriptions confirmed that Tartary was not like home. It was outsized, almost endless, mobile societies. Again and again accounts mentioned tents, felt yurts, wagons, herds, people who seemed to have no fixed city except in winter, who might be found one year in one valley, the next year on a different river. Travel writers described the shock of arriving at a capital one season and finding only trampled grass the next. Seasonal movement. The cycle of winter camps and summer pastures impressed itself on visitors who thought of land ownership as a matter of fixed fields and stone houses. They noted with awe or alarm that entire communities could move with the seasons, taking political authority, military strength, and taxable wealth with them. Powerful courts, amid all this motion, travellers also encountered striking centres of power. A Khan's encampment with silken tents and ranks of guards. A winter palace in an oasis city, full of scribes and astrologers. The headquarters of a banner commander under the Qing, where emissaries from far-flung tribes came to offer tribute. To a European envoy, these felt like royal courts in familiar miniature, even when their inner workings followed different logics. Those recurring motifs were not fiction, They do match what we know from archaeology, indigenous chronicles, and later ethnography, a world organised around long distances, shifting camps, and nodal centres of authority. But the way they were reported, what was highlighted, what was blurred, also created distortions. For one thing, most eyewitnesses moved along privileged corridors. They travelled where caravans could go, where roads and postal stations already existed, where empires wanted foreigners to move. A merchant who rode from Tabriz to Bukhara to Kashgar saw major market cities and the big confederations that taxed them. A friar going to the Mongol court visited or heard about the principal camps of the ruling lineage. He did not see every small river valley where a few hundred people grazed their animals, far from main routes. He did not attend the village assemblies of minor clans, or the quiet trade between neighbouring tribes who had no interest in impressing distant kings. So his account of the Tartars tends to describe the elites he met and the roads he took, then stretch those impressions across the map. Another filter was language itself. When a Venetian or a Frenchman or a Spaniard wrote about the people he encountered, he reached for the words he knew. Tartars became a catch-all for Turks, Mongols, Manchus, Kazakhs, Kalmyks, Bashkirs and many others who shared a style of riding, clothing or warfare, but not a single identity. A traveller might hear different self-names from different groups along the way, but in his book they became these Tartars and those Tartars, divided by religion or loyalty, rather than by language family or local lineage. His translator might then erase even those nuances, rendering both simply as Tatars in the target tongue. Expectations did the rest. By the time later travellers set out, they already had the previous books in mind. They knew Eastern riders were supposed to be fierce and warlike, so they noticed armed bands and took less interest in herders, quietly minding their animals. They expected great khans with absolute power, so they interpreted every negotiation as the whim of a single autocrat, even when local leaders were actually balancing complex clan politics. Stories of cruelty and marvel played well with readers. Tales of everyday bargaining over grazing rights did not. So the Tartary that emerged from the travel literature was at once grounded and exaggerated. Grounded because the large patterns were right. The steppe really did demand seasonal movement. Power really did often take the form of mobile courts and tribute-gathering expeditions rather than stone-walled capitals. Caravan routes really did stitch together distant oases, making possible astonishing journeys that linked Europe, the Middle East, India and China, exaggerated, because the diversity within those patterns blurred into a single theatrical backdrop. Whole peoples disappeared into the generic Tartar. Local rivalries, religious debates, and cultural fashions compressed into a single description that might have been copied from a book written 50 years before. Even some of the wins of the travelogues came with caveats. Writers were often good at relative distances. How long it took to go from Khiva to Bukhara. How many camps lay between the Volga and the Ural River. They noticed key products. Horses from this region, furs from that, particular kinds of cloth or tea from another. They sketched the rough shape of climates, describing bitter winters in one zone, harsh deserts in another. Those details, accumulated over time, did help Europeans build a truer picture of inner Eurasia. At the same time, travellers could be sweeping in their generalizations. Religions were sometimes flattened into "these Tartars follow Mahomet" or "they are idolaters," categories that erased internal splits between Sunni and Shia, between different Sufi orders, between Buddhist schools, between people who combined older practices with newer creeds. Social structures were simplified into terms like tribe and horde, making fluid alliances seem like fixed ethnic blocks. One writer might meet a Kazakh group during a particularly disastrous drought and report that the Tartars here are starving and wretched, while another, visiting a different confederation in a time of plenty, reported inexhaustible herds and sumptuous hospitality. Both impressions could coexist in European libraries, unconnected to specific dates or contexts, and yet both would be treated as timeless truths about Tartary. As decades turned into centuries, another quiet process magnified those distortions. Old travel accounts kept being reprinted. Editors abridged, modernized the language, and sometimes stitched multiple sources together into composite portraits. A description of Mongol courts from the 13th century might be laid alongside observations of 17th century Kalmyks, without clear signposts for the reader that empires had risen and fallen in the intervening time. By the 18th century, some writers were describing Tartary from behind a desk, having never set foot east of Vienna. They quoted earlier travellers as if their words still captured the living present. Even when the polities they described had fragmented, converted to new religions, or been absorbed into Russian or Qing administration, an envoy's urgent dispatch about the might of a particular Khan became, in a later encyclopedia, a calm statement about the permanent organization of the Tatars. A missionary's tentative guess about a language family hardened into an authoritative classification. Each retelling smoothed away qualifiers. Some say it is reported that, according to local rumour, those hedging phrases often vanished in later summaries. What had been a traveller's impression on a particular road in a particular year turned into an apparently solid fact about an entire region. Maps absorbed this confidence. A line in a book that once meant, "to the north there are," said to be various tribes under a certain prince, became a neat label. Tartary of such and such Khan. When that Khan's heirs lost power, the text on the map might stay the same for decades, because the engraver's reference shelf had not yet caught up. So even as caravans continued to move, confederations to split and merge, and new powers to rise, the cognitive map in European minds remained strangely static. It was shaped less by the living steppe than by the sediment of past reports. This is one reason the legend of a single coherent Tartary could later find such fertile ground. When people in the present look back at those maps and those travelogues, they see a chorus of confident voices, all agreeing that there was a place out there with one great name. What they do not always see is the scaffolding of hearsay, translation, and expectation underneath. The way real landscapes and societies were squeezed into familiar stories by travellers trying to make sense of strangeness for readers at home. The next act in the story came when the powers closest to that interior, Muscovy, and later Imperial Russia, began to move out of the realm of rumour and into the realm of direct control. Their own reports and their own ambitions would start to overwrite older travellers' tales, even as they borrowed some of their language. When Muscovite princes first appear in this story, they are not the masters of anything called Tartary. They are one set of rulers on the forested fringe of that world. For a long time, the power relationship even ran the other way. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Rus princes rode to the camps of Mongol and Turkic Khans to receive patents to rule. They paid tribute, sent hostages, navigated steppe politics, just like any other client. From a European perspective, those forest principalities sat at the edge of the great, vague expanse labelled Tartaria. Over the next few centuries, that relationship inverted, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and periods of crisis. The rulers of Moscow moved from paying tribute to collecting it, first in the forests and fields around them, then out onto the steppe, and eventually across the huge spaces that mapmakers had once filled with the single comfortable word, Tartary. Understanding how that happened helps explain why the label began to crumble. The engines that drove Muscovy eastward were not mysterious. One was fur. If you imagine Siberia as nothing but snow and emptiness, it may be hard to see how it could fund an empire. But on European and Mediterranean markets, certain animals of the north were almost a form of currency. Sable, ermine, fox, beaver marten. Their pelts lined noble cloaks, trimmed royal robes, backed financial deals. In an age before fossil fuels, fur was also warmth. Russian chronicles and account books from the 15th and 16th centuries read, at times, like ledgers of fur extraction. Tribute measured not only in coins or grain, but in so many sables, so many foxes. Envoys sent to distant tribes were given instructions in how much fur revenue they were expected to secure. To get those furs, Moscow needed access to the forests and river systems where fur-bearing animals lived, and to the indigenous hunters who knew how to find them. That leads to the second engine, rivers. If you look at a modern map of northern Eurasia, the great Siberian rivers, Ob, Yenisei, Lena, Amur, run like vertical columns from south to north, from the forest steppe deep into the Arctic Ocean. In the age of the horse and the canoe, those rivers were highways. Muscovite expansion followed them. Cossack detachments and service nobles went out along the Volga, then over the Urals into the basin of the Ob. From there they hopped from watershed to watershed, using portages that local people had known for centuries. Each new river reached meant a new corridor for trade, tribute, and military movement. Along those waterways, the empire planted its third engine, forts. The Russian word ostrog, stockade, captures the basic idea. These were not always massive stone fortresses, often they were palisaded enclosures of wood, thrown up on a river bend or at the mouth of a tributary. Inside, a garrison of soldiers, a voevoda, military governor, a small Orthodox church, a jail, storehouses. Around them grew settlements of traders, blacksmiths, craftsmen, and the families of soldiers. Indigenous people came to trade, barter, or, sometimes under pressure, to deliver tribute. That tribute, yasak, was the fourth engine. Yasak was often paid in furs. In theory, it marked the acceptance of the Tsar's overlordship by local peoples. In practice, it was negotiated over and over. Some groups offered yasak voluntarily, hoping to gain a powerful ally against enemies. Others did so after being defeated in battle. Still others agreed on paper but tried to dodge collectors, moving camps or slipping away into harder-to-reach terrain. The combination of these four elements, furs, rivers, forts and tribute, created a kind of imperial ratchet. Each fort put up on a river altered the political and economic balance around it. Hunters who had once carried their pelts to a Turkic Khan or a local headman now had the option, or the obligation, of taking them to the Russian Ostrog. Local leaders who could mediate between their people and the new garrison gained leverage and sometimes Russian titles. Over time, these arrangements hardened. What began as a seasonal trading station became a permanent town. What started as an ad hoc tribute agreement became a fixed tax category in a Moscow office. Names that had been simple geographic descriptions, land of such and such people on such and such river, turned into districts with administrators, scribes and seals. None of this happened in a vacuum. The people Muscovy and later Imperial Russia encountered on their eastern and southern frontiers were not blank spaces waiting to be organized. They were Turkic and Mongolic speaking groups with their own histories of confederation, alliance and empire, Tatars of the Volga and Crimea, Nogais, Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Kalmyks, various Siberian and Manchu Tungusic peoples. Sometimes relations were violently hostile. Raids and counter-raids along the frontier were common. Cossack detachments burned villages and seized herds. Steppe raiders struck Russian border towns, taking captives and livestock. Forts were besieged, punitive expeditions devastated grazing lands. Sometimes they were transactional. Khanates made treaties with Moscow, trading military support or peaceful borders for subsidies, gifts and recognition of their internal autonomy. Bashkir and other groups entered into agreements that promised them protection and certain rights in exchange for allegiance and taxes. And sometimes they blurred elite families intermarried. Some Turkic nobles took service with the Tsar, becoming part of the Russian aristocracy, while still commanding loyalty on the steppe. Kazakh and Kalmyk leaders might alternately appeal to Moscow or to other steppe powers, playing them off one another. From a steppe perspective, this was an extension of older patterns, another large court to negotiate with, another possible source of gifts, titles, and backing. From a European mapmaker's perspective, something more dramatic seemed to be happening. As Russian explorers and officials sent back reports, European atlases began to show more detail in the great blank space to the north of the Central Asian oases and to the west of China. Instead of a single vague Great Tartary, you start to see Muscovite Tartary or Russian Tartary creep onto maps, especially in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Sometimes Siberia appears as a label, first as a region within Tartary, then as a name that competes with it. The word Siberia itself likely comes from a local ethnonym in western Siberia, but under Russian rule it expanded. Administrators in Tobolsk or Tomsk might talk about specific tribes and uezd districts, but in European languages, Siberia gradually became the catch-all term for Russia's Asian domains north of the Kazakh steppe. So you get a transitional period. An atlas plate might show Tartaria sprawled over the centre of the continent, but above it, in a different script, Siberi or Siberia is written along the rivers where Russian forts now stood. To the west, Tartaria Moscovitica merges into territories coloured as part of the Russian Empire. Russian mapmakers themselves were part of this shift. By the 18th century, under Peter the Great and his successors, there were state-sponsored expeditions to survey Siberia, the Far East and the Pacific coast. Astronomers and geodesists took measurements. Detailed maps were compiled from the reports of officers who had actually travelled the rivers, visited the ostrogs, and enumerated the people paying yasak. The more those maps circulated through European scholarly networks, the less room was left for the old undifferentiated Tartary. Administrative reality had a way of pushing aside umbrella labels. When a region is mostly known through rumour, it is easy to give it one big name. When there is a local governor, a census, customs posts, and a regular stream of correspondence, specific names start to matter. Officials in St. Petersburg did not talk about ruling Tartary. They talked about governing the Tobolsk province, the Yakutsk province, the Yakutsk district. They distinguished between Bashkir lands, Kazakh hoarders under different sultans, Buryat clans, Efenk groups, Cossack hosts. Those distinctions were not always fair or accurate by local standards. They flattened their own complexities, but they were different from the earlier blanket Tatar of Western travelogues. European reference works began to catch up. Encyclopedias that in one edition spoke of Asiatic Tartary might, a few decades later, subdivide it into Russian possessions in Asia, independent Tartary, for the still autonomous Central Asian khanates, and Chinese Tartary for Qing-ruled Inner Asia. Within the Russian section, Siberia became the preferred term. In other words, Tartary did not vanish overnight. It shrank. First it fractured into this Tartary and that Tartary, Muscovite, Chinese, independent. Then the parts where administrative control was thickest and best documented began to be renamed in more specific imperial terms. Furs still moved. So did caravans, nomad camps, and local politics. But on paper, the way Europeans imagined the interior of Eurasia was being redrawn, this time not only by distant merchants and friars, but by a state that claimed the land, built the forts and filed the paperwork. For later readers, flipping through old atlases, this creates a confusing overlay. On one page, Great Tartary looms as a single presence. On the next, a more modern map shows Russian Empire in Asia, Siberia, Kyrgyz hordes under Russian protection. The same physical spaces are there, the same rivers and grasslands, but they are being slotted into a different conceptual grid. This gradual replacement of older umbrella labels by administrative ones is crucial for understanding how a once dominant word like Tartary could almost evaporate from official discourse. yet linger as a ghost in popular imagination. Where a state extended its bureaucratic reach, filing, taxing, surveying, the old name retreated. Where that reach was thin or contested, across the Kazakh steppe, in Central Asian oases, in the highlands between empires, the label Tartary held on longer, a convenient shorthand for places not yet fully drawn into someone's system. On the eastern side of the continent, another power was engaged in a parallel process. While Muscovy and then Russia were pushing out across the Siberian rivers, the Qing dynasty in China was extending its own authority across Inner Asia, absorbing Mongol and Turkic polities that European writers also habitually grouped under Tartary. Their story and how it fed the label Chinese Tartary would add another layer to the way this imagined land was carved up, renamed, and eventually forgotten. By the time Russian officials were filing reports from Irkutsk and Yakutsk, something just as far-reaching was happening on the other side of the steppe. A new dynasty had taken power in Beijing, and it was not Han Chinese. The Qing founders were Manchus, descended from Jurchen and other Tungusic-speaking groups in the forests and plains northeast of the Great Wall. To late Ming Chinese observers, they were outer peoples. To many Inner Asian neighbours, they were one more contender in the overlapping world of steppe and forest politics. To European readers very far away, they would become part of something called Chinese Tartary. But that label hides what's really interesting, how the Qing actually reshaped Inner Asia and how those changes trickled back into European atlases in bits and pieces. When the future Qing rulers first emerged, they didn't call themselves an empire over Tartary. They organized their followers under a distinctive system, the 8 banners. The banner system divided Manchu society into military administrative units, each with its own leadership, land and obligations. It wasn't just a way of mustering troops, it was a way of structuring an entire ruling elite, regulating marriage, residence and service. As the Manchu state expanded, those banners absorbed others. Mongol nobles who joined the new order were slotted into separate Mongol banners. Some Han Chinese who took service were enrolled in Chinese banners. What looked from a distance like a simple conquest was, up close, a careful project of classification. Who belonged to which banner, who owed what service, who could claim which privileges. This internal logic matters for our story because it shaped how the Qing saw their own realm, and it looked nothing like the broad European word Tartary. Over the 17th century, the Qing did something no Chinese dynasty had done on this scale before. They pushed their authority deep into Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and what Europeans would later call Manchuria. Mongol khans and princes accepted Qing overlordship, or were defeated and then bound by treaty. The great Irat confederations in the west were battled, bargained with, and gradually broken. Tibetan rulers were drawn into a protector-patron relationship with the Qing court. In the far northwest, the Qing fought a grinding campaign against the Dzungar state, eventually devastating it and incorporating much of its former pastureland. From an Inner Asian perspective, this was a major rearrangement of power. Old steppe polities that had once dealt primarily with other nomadic empires now found the centre of gravity pulling toward Beijing. Tribute missions, marriage alliances, religious patronage, and military oversight all began to radiate from the Qing court. From a Qing bureaucrat's perspective, it also meant a thicket of new administrative categories. Manchuria, the homeland of the ruling elite, was not just northeast China, it was the 3 eastern provinces in some contexts, a protected banner homeland in others. Mongol territories were divided into banners and leagues, each with specified obligations and internal autonomy. Tibet had its own institutions overseen by imperial representatives. The lands that would later be called Xinjiang were organized into new provinces and military garrisons only after long contested campaigns. This was not, in other words, one big undifferentiated Tartar land under China. It was a layered imperial structure, with different peoples slotted into different slots, governed through separate legal regimes. But that is not how it looked from faraway Amsterdam or Paris. European knowledge of the Qing realm arrived in pulses through missionaries, merchants, and the occasional embassy. Jesuit astronomers wrote long descriptions of court ceremonies and city plans. Traders along the Canton system wrote about coastal regulations. Diplomats who were allowed to travel with their caravans through Mongolia or Xinjiang left accounts of guarded routes and distant garrisons. Almost no one from Europe had the vantage point to see the whole system at once. Mapmakers did what they had always done when information was uneven. They stitched together what they had and filled the blank spaces with familiar words. China, they thought they understood. The coastal provinces, the old heartlands along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, had appeared in travelogues for centuries. But north and west of that core lay zones that were obviously not Russia, obviously not the small, independent Central Asian khanates, and yet seemed to be under the authority of the Qing emperor. Old habits kicked in. Those lands had once been labelled Tartary, so when they appeared in the orbit of China, they became Chinese Tartary. On many 18th century European maps, you can see this compromise. The territory coloured in the same shade as China extends far beyond the Great Wall, up into Manchuria across Mongolia, and into the deserts toward the Tian Shan. Somewhere in that band, in a slightly different font, the cartographer writes Tartaria Chinense, Chinese Tartary, or Tartary Chinoise. It is less a claim about local identity than a way of saying, these northern and western frontiers, which earlier generations lumped into Tartary, now appear to be ruled from Beijing. The contrast with Qing categories is stark. A Qing memorial might speak of Outer Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, the 8 banners in the capital, the Kashgar region, Tibet, each with separate regulations. Officials distinguished between bannermen and commoners, between Mongol subjects bound by their own customary law and Han farmers governed by the civil code. The European word Tartary blurred all of that. From London or Leiden, steppe herders north of Beijing and oasis towns in the Tarim Basin could end up under the same umbrella, simply because they lay beyond the settled agricultural core that Europeans associated with China proper. The difference was not just semantic. It also reflected how borders were being imagined. Inside the Qing system, the frontier was not a sharp, inked line on a map. It was a zone of forts, banners, regulated pastures, and negotiated loyalties. Certain rivers marked tax jurisdictions. Some mountain ranges framed cultural boundaries. Garrison towns acted as nodes tying mobile populations into an imperial grid. Banner organization made this visible. Each Mongol banner had defined pasture lands. Banner nobles pledged allegiance to the Qing emperor, attended imperial rituals and in return retained recognized control over their herds and people. Manchu banner garrisons were planted in key cities, from Beijing to Urumqi, forming a lattice of imperial presence across Inner Asia. European mapmakers, hearing about these arrangements second or third hand, tended not to reproduce the nuance. They preferred lines. Treaties between the Qing and Russia reinforced that habit. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, agreements such as Nerchinsk and Kyakhta attempted to settle where one empire's influence ended and the other's began. The texts spoke in terms of rivers, mountains, and mutual obligations, but European copies of these treaties often reduced them to border strokes. On maps printed in Europe, a line snakes across the north, and one side is coloured Russia in Asia, while the other, down through Mongolia and Manchuria, is often branded Chinese Tartary. The irony is that those very treaties were themselves products of frontier governance. They came out of real clashes, Cossack forts bumping up against Qing-protected hunting grounds, missionary journeys that crossed unwelcome merchants who wandered beyond acceptable corridors. Officials on both sides had to decide who was allowed to collect taxes where, which caravans could pass, which locals were counted as whose subjects. Those decisions showed up on the ground as new forts, new customs stations, new banner assignments. They showed up in Europe as new borderlines and new labels. News of Qing victories and annexations travelled even more unevenly. Some events made a splash. The crushing of the Zhenghe state in the mid-18th century, for example, filtered west through Russian and missionary channels. Reports spoke of a once formidable inner Asian power being destroyed, its lands absorbed by the Qing. Mapmakers responded by extending the colour of China farther into Central Asia, shading deserts and mountains they had never seen. Other developments hardly registered. The slow integration of different Mongol groups, the codification of banner regulations, the creation of new provincial structures in parts of Xinjiang, these were matters for Qing memorials and edicts. They were not the sort of things that easily turned into dramatic stories for a European audience. So atlases lagged. A map plate engraved in 1750 might show Chinese Tartary as a vast, vague block stretching from the Amur to the fringes of Tibet. Another, printed half a century later, might break off Mongolia and Manchuria as subregions, while still hanging the word Tartary over the top. Behind those shifting labels, the on-the-ground reality was moving in a different rhythm. Qing administrators were counting households, regulating grazing, assigning banner troops and issuing passes. They were dealing with rebellions, migrations, religious disputes. They were concerned with which lama had authority over which monastery, which local chief could be trusted with which frontier post. European writers, working from patchy reports, mostly saw that there was a powerful Chinese state whose influence had spread into lands they had once filed under Tartary. Chinese Tartary was their shortcut for that observation. That shortcut would linger. Like Russian Tartary or independent Tartary, it marked a phase when old blanket terms for Inner Asia were being stretched, subdivided and slowly replaced by more specific names tied to particular empires and polities. In the next part of the story, another piece of that landscape takes centre stage. The Central Asian khanates that European maps often left under the fading banner of independent Tartary, and that later legends would insist were once part of a single forgotten realm. If you move your attention west from Qing garrisons and Mongol banners, across the deserts and mountain chains, you arrive in another world that old maps flattened into Tartary. Here, instead of one empire reaching out from a single capital, you find something more like an archipelago of power. Khanates, emirates, tribal confederations, oasis cities, mobile clans. Names that sound faintly familiar if you've ever glanced at a 19th century history of Central Asia, Khiva, Bukhara, Kokand. To the north, the Kazakh juzes or hordes, divided into Great, Middle and Little. Farther south and east, the legacy of the Chagatai Ulus. To the west, the shifting influence of Persia. To the northwest, the long shadow of Russia. To a map maker in Paris or London. All of this could easily be one large, indistinct, independent Tartary. To people living there, it was anything but simple. Take the Khanate of Khiva, for instance, centred on the oasis of Khwarazm, near the lower Amudarya River. Khiva's power rested on irrigated agriculture. Fields of cotton, wheat and melons fed the city. A narrow belt of green, pulled out of the desert by canals, and careful water management, supported craftsmen, scholars and the Khan's administration. Beyond that band of cultivation lay a patchwork of semi-nomadic communities, Turkmen tribes and sandy wastes. To the southeast lay Bukhara, an older and, in many eyes, more prestigious polity. Sometimes a Khanate, sometimes an emirate. It claimed the legacy of great Islamic learning. The cities of Bukhara and Samarkand anchored its authority. Madrasas, Sufi lodges, mosques, and bustling bazaars gave it a reputation as a centre of religion and trade. Northeast again, later in time, the Khanate of Kokand took shape in the Fergana Valley. Fergana was another oasis region, lush where water spread out from rivers into fields, ringed by mountains. Kokand's rulers built fortresses and caravanserais, tried to control the mountain passes, and extended their influence over neighbouring valleys and towns. To northern Europeans, peering at sparse reports, Khiva, Bukhara, Kokand, and their neighbours could look like fragments of one lost unity. Their rulers sometimes traced ancestry back to the Chinggisid past. They shared elements of Turkic language, Islamic law, and steppe custom. They traded with one another, fought one another, intermarried. On a late 18th century atlas, they might be marked only with a few dots, and the vague label Bukhara or Khiva floating in a sea of Tartary. But politically, these were separate states. And they acted like it. They minted their own coins, negotiated their own treaties, and waged wars against each other as readily as against any outside empire. Borders were not lines in our modern sense, but they were recognized spheres of influence. This valley paid taxes to Bukhara, that cluster of villages sent tribute to Kokand. This tribe of Turkmen took protection money from Khiva's caravans. If you imagine a single centralized Tartarian empire sprawled across this region, you have to ignore a constant low hum of rivalry and alliance that never resolved into one enduring unified state. It's worth pausing on why Central Asia's geography encouraged fragmentation. The steppe to the north favoured mobile pastoral societies. The oases in the south and east favoured compact irrigated city-states. Mountain ranges like the Tian Shan and Pamirs cut off valleys from one another, turning each into its own little world. A Khan in Bukhara could send troops into a neighbouring oasis. He could extract tribute from a mountain village. He could claim nominal sovereignty over distant clans. But holding all of Central Asia in a tight administrative grip, with a single bureaucracy and a single law code, was a scale of control that almost no one in the region attempted, and no one maintained for long. The great exceptions, the empires of Chinggis Khan and his immediate successors, were remembered precisely because they were unusual. Even those Mongol realms quickly split into Ulysses, into separate khanates that spent more time balancing against each other than acting as parts of one seamless machine. Later, European writers often treated Tartary in a book as if it implied something like a national state. If a map said independent Tartary, some modern readers assume that means a politically unified sovereign country that just happened to be forgotten. But for most early modern authors, the phrase did not carry that implication. Independent Tartary more often meant, this part of Inner Asia does not appear to be under the authority of either the Russian Tsar or the Chinese Emperor. It was a negative category, not a positive blueprint. A way of saying, not yet claimed by one of the big empires we recognize, not ruled by a single hidden one. Within that loosely defined belt lived a whole spectrum of regimes, from strong khanates to very local tribal coalitions. Their politics were driven by factors that do not fit neatly into later European ideas of sovereignty. Diplomacy, for example, was personal as well as territorial. A Khan of Kokand might send a delegation to Bukhara, asking for recognition and titles. A ruler in Khiva might seek investiture letters from the Ottoman Sultan, the Persian Shah, or both, framing himself as a defender of Islam on a contested frontier. Marriages linked ruling houses. Sufi sheikhs and respected scholars travelled between courts, mediating disputes and conferring religious legitimacy. Islamic law, Sharia, existed alongside customary steppe law or yaza. Judges in city courts issued rulings grounded in religious scholarship. At the same time, tribal elders arbitrated by older norms about compensation, blood price, and honour. Rulers had to navigate both worlds, appealing to religion in one context and to steppe custom in another. Trade was equally central. Caravans of textiles, tea, spices, furs, and slaves moved along routes that tied Central Asia to Russia, Persia, India, and China. Control over caravan routes, bridge crossings, and market towns could make or break a Khan's treasury. Customs taxes were a major source of income. So were outright raids. Which brings us to a darker but important part of the story: slavery. Raiding for captives was a long-standing feature of the region. Kazakh, Turkmen, Uzbek, and other groups attacked one another, and neighbouring settled populations, taking prisoners who could be ransomed, sold, or absorbed. Russian settlers and soldiers on the steppe frontier were tempting targets. Persian villages too were vulnerable. The khanates' markets in Khiva and Bukhara became notorious in Russian and European accounts as centres of slave trading. For local rulers, this was tangled up with politics. Raiding asserted dominance, delivered plunder to followers, and provided bargaining chips in negotiations with neighbours. Religion, trade, and violence were intertwined, not neatly separated. Foreign observers struggled to decode this. When Russian envoys arrived in Bukhara or Khiva, they often tried to read what they saw through their own administrative categories. They looked for borders that could be agreed on, sovereigns who had clear, uncontested authority over clearly bounded territories, fixed rules about who belonged where. What they found instead were overlapping claims. A clan might move seasonally between lands belonging to two different rulers, paying something to both. A Khan's writ might run strongly in his capital but weakly in a distant district where a local notable held real sway. Treaties with Russia might be honoured in one part of a realm and quietly ignored in another. From a steppe or oasis perspective, this was normal. Power was relational, based on who you could persuade, reward, or coerce at any given moment. Governance rested on personal bonds, patronage networks, and religious authority as much as on written decrees. A khanate's border was often a zone where allegiance and tax obligations were negotiated year by year. Outsiders trying to turn that into lines on a map almost inevitably misunderstood the fluidity. All of this began to shift in the 19th century, when what Europeans later called the Great Game brought new pressures to bear on Central Asia. Russian expansion from the north accelerated, forts crept southward along the steppe, Cossack settlements advanced. The Kazakh hordes were gradually pulled into a web of imperial administration. What had once been negotiated, seasonal arrangements began to be replaced with fixed districts, censuses, and direct taxation. Britain, worrying about its Indian empire, watched these developments closely. So did Persia. Central Asian rulers found themselves trying to play off great powers as well as local rivals. The khanates were forced into a world where treaties carried different weight. When Russia annexed territory from Kokand, or forced Bukhara to accept a protectorate, it also generated new documents, new maps, new classifications. European geographers responded by retiring independent Tartary in favour of more specific phrases: Russian Turkestan, Emirate of Bukhara, Russian Protectorate, Khanate of Khiva, Afghanistan. What had once been a vague void on the map filled up with labelled units tied directly to imperial bureaucracies. In that process, the older, looser sense of Tartary receded. The idea that this whole belt between Russia, Persia, and China might be one single realm became harder to sustain once Russian officials were publishing lists of districts, railway timetables, and tax schedules for each conquered region. But the word Tartary did not vanish all at once. It lingered as a ghost term, especially in older books and maps that remained in circulation. Later readers encountering independent Tartary attached to a blank central space sometimes projected their own ideas onto it. Perhaps this was a single nation, perhaps a lost empire, perhaps a civilization erased. The reality, seen up close in the 19th century, was different. It was a mosaic of khanates and confederations, threaded together by trade and religion, divided by rivalry and geography, gradually being pulled apart and reshaped by Russian and British ambitions. As the Great Game rebranded these lands with new names, another transformation was happening in the language Europeans used for Inner Asia itself. The old elastic word Tartary was beginning to split, fade, and flow into a new vocabulary of nations and regions, a shift that would quietly prepare the ground for the way people talk about this supposed lost empire today. If you trace this change carefully, you notice something almost biological. Words behave a little like populations. They spread, they mutate, they split into new branches, and sometimes they go extinct in ordinary speech, even while they survive in a few sheltered pockets of print. Tartary is one of those words. It grew out of tatar, and tatar itself had a long, complicated life before it ever reached a European page. In the beginning, tatar was an ethnonym, a name used for particular steppe groups in Inner Asia. Chinese sources in the Liao and Jin periods mention tribes the authors transcribed as something like tatar. These were not yet the unified Mongol armies of Genghis Khan, and they were not a generic label for all nomads. They were specific peoples in a specific region. Then came the Mongol expansion. When the Mongol Confederation surged westward, many of the groups Europeans encountered on the frontier were called Tatars by their neighbours. The word reached Rus chroniclers and then Latin Christendom like a rumour attached to a wave of terror. Some Western writers blended it with Tartarus, the classical underworld, and you begin to see Tartary and Tartarus sliding together in sermons and chronicles. Were these Tatars instruments of divine punishment from the pit of hell? Some authors leaned into the pun. At the same time, Muslim writers in Persian, Arabic, and Turkic were using their own terms. They could distinguish between Mongols, various Turkic tribes, and particular lineages. They knew that not every horseman under a Mongol banner was a Tatar, but when those reports filtered into Latin or French or Italian, the fine distinctions blurred. To be attacked by Tatars became a phrase for being hit by steppe raiders of almost any background. Here an ethnonym, Tatar, was already becoming an exonym, an outsider label, used by people at a distance, applied broadly to groups who might not have used it for themselves, or who used it in more limited ways. That's one of the first patterns you see with names in history, close up. People categorize themselves with a whole vocabulary: clan names, tribal names, religious affiliations, local origins. Far away, outsiders paste on one or two broad labels and call it a day. Over time, those outsider labels can harden, especially when they are written down. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European mapmakers were dealing with a familiar problem. They were hearing about peoples called Tatars in several different places. On the Volga, in Crimea, in the Kazakh steppe, deep in Central Asia, even on the fringes of Manchuria. The details differed, but the word stayed the same. One solution was to stretch Tatar to cover them all. Another was to derive a territory name from the people's name. If there are Tatars, they must live in a land of Tartary. So Tatar, the ethnonym, flexible and context-bound, fed into Tartary, the big vague region on the map. From that moment, the drift accelerated. Tartar, in European languages, stopped being a narrow term and became a sort of generic tag for steppe Muslims north and east of the Black Sea. Russian sources spoke of Crimean Tatars, Kazan Tatars, Nogai Tatars, Siberian Tatars. Western writers collapsed many of these into a single imagined category, the Tartars. A travel account might mention Tartars hired as guides in Siberia, Tartars raiding the Polish frontier, and Tartars guarding caravan routes near Bokhara without noticing how different these groups were from one another. Context changed the meaning. In a Russian frontier report, Tatars might mean specific, named communities with known obligations and treaties. In a French missionary's letter, the same word might mean non-Russian, non-Chinese, non-Persian peoples of the steppe who ride horses and follow Islam or some other unfamiliar faith. The label floated, picking up and dropping references as it went. The printing press gave this floating label a kind of artificial stability. Once a term appears in a printed book, especially in a reference work, it gains weight. 16th and 17th century cosmographies, world descriptions, began to include sections on Tartary. Alongside Europe, Asia, and Africa, early encyclopedias and dictionaries provided neat definitions. Tartary became a vast country in the northern parts of Asia and Europe, inhabited by the Tatars. The circle closed. A vague ethnonym had been turned into a region, then used to define its own people. Each new edition copied the old wording, sometimes tweaking the borders slightly, rarely questioning the basic category. By the 18th century, educated Europeans might learn about Tartary first, not from direct contact, but from schoolbooks and atlases. The name entered their imagination before they saw any alternative. Inside Russia, inside the Qing Empire, inside the khanates, the story was different. There, administrators and scholars were creating their own taxonomies. They distinguished between Bashkirs and Kazakhs, between Crimean Tatars and Volga Tatars, between Mongols under different banners, between Manchus and various Jurchen groups. But those distinctions took time to leak out into Western print. When they did, they collided with that older printed scaffold. 19th century geographers began to replace Tartary with a patchwork of newer regional names. Siberia for the enormous north, gradually absorbed by the Russian Empire. Central Asia for the oases and deserts around Bukhara, Khiva and Kokand, and later for their Russian colonial successors. Mongolia for lands dominated by Mongol-speaking peoples between the Gobi and the forests. Manchuria for the northeastern territories associated with the Manchu homeland. Turkestan for the belt of predominantly Turkic-speaking Muslim regions that Russian and other empires were dividing and naming. Each of these terms had its own history and its own ambiguities, but all of them chipped away at the old monolith of Tartary. The change did not happen overnight. A traveller in 1820 might still title his work Travels in Chinese Tartary, while a geographer in 1850 preferred Manchuria and Mongolia. A British strategist might write about Russian designs on Central Asia and Turkestan, while still referring, in the same breath, to the Tatars as a people. Old labels and new labels coexisted, overlapped, and sometimes contradicted each other. Reference books lagged even more. An encyclopedia printed in 1840 might still include a long article on Tartary, summarizing decades-old information, even as newer volumes introduced separate entries on Siberia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and Manchuria. The older entry did not vanish. It remained there like a fossil layer beneath the newer strata. And that brings us to a final twist in the story of language drift. Names linger. They survive in poetry after they have disappeared from policy memos. They crop up in sermons, in children's books, in the inherited vocabulary of families who learned their geography before the latest renaming. They persist in second-hand and third-hand copies of maps and atlases, sold cheaply, reprinted without revision, hung on walls for generations. Tartary survived in these ways. Long after Russian officials were filing reports under headings like Tomsk Province or Turkestan General Governorate, a village school somewhere in Europe or America might still have a faded wall map dividing the north into European Russia and Tartary. Long after Qing bureaucrats had categorized their northeastern domains under specific provincial names, a missionary society might still fund projects in Chinese Tartary. The word no longer matched the political reality on the ground, but it lived on in habits of speech and in the inertia of print. And once a term is embedded like that, generations later it can be rediscovered, detached from its original context, and made to mean something new. Someone opens an old atlas, sees Great Tartary spanning a half-empty continent, and wonders why such a vast land would simply disappear from modern maps. The answer lies less in a vanished empire and more in this slow, almost invisible drift of language. Ethnonyms turning into exonyms, exonyms inflating into regional labels, printers and compilers freezing those labels into reference works, and newer names gradually eroding the old without quite erasing them. The Tartary of early modern books was never a single unified state. It was a loose, convenient word that hardened in ink and then cracked apart into Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, Manchuria, and Turkestan as knowledge deepened and empires advanced. But that old word still lingers like a ghost image on the page, inviting new stories to be told about what it might once have meant. In the 19th century, that ghost on the page met a new kind of pressure. For hundreds of years, a mapmaker could get away with hazy frontiers. Here be Tartary was close enough for an area most of your buyers would never see. But the 19th century was not kind to vagueness. Steam engines, repeating rifles, long-distance telegraphs, and centralized bureaucracies all pulled in the same direction. States wanted to know exactly what they owned, exactly where it stopped, and exactly who lived inside it. That meant the old cloud-like regions on maps had to be turned into lines. And once you start drawing precise lines, a word like Tartary begins to look very out of place. Think about the technologies that underpinned this change. Land surveys, for one, earlier empires had measured land, of course, but 19th century surveying was systematic, methodical, and often carried out with a kind of missionary zeal. Triangulation networks marched across continents. Survey parties lugged theodolites and chains through forests, across deserts, up mountain passes. They weren't just sketching rivers and guessing at distances. They were fixing coordinates, calculating elevations, producing maps that could be overlaid, combined, and checked against one another. Along the new railways, this precision was essential. You could not build a track somewhere through Tartary. You needed gradients, river crossings, supply depots, telegraph poles. So railroad men and military engineers demanded more than the old broad labels. They wanted place names they could plug into timetables, stations that appeared on the right milepost, borders that matched the checkpoints on the ground. As rails pushed into Siberia, into Manchuria, into the Central Asian oases, the white space on European maps shrank, and with it the comfortable stretch of Tartary. At the same time, imperial bureaucracies were swelling. In St. Petersburg, and later in Tiflis and Tashkent, Russian officials classified new lands as gubernors, oblasts, okrugs. They counted villages and yurt encampments, levied taxes, divided populations into categories that made sense to their administrative logic. Cossacks, Inurotsi, Sarts, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs. In Beijing, the late Qing government maintained its own intricate paperwork for the banner lands of Inner Mongolia, the frontier provinces of Xinjiang, the prefectures of Manchuria. In British India, officials compiled thick gazetteers of Turkestan, Baluchistan, and the northwest frontier. Different empires, different languages, but the same underlying urge to take a messy human landscape and break it into countable, nameable units. Within those offices, Tartary was useless. You could not issue a tax regulation for Tartary when the law had to specify which district, which sub-district, which group of taxpayers would be affected. So the word retreated from the documents that actually governed people's lives. On the ground, the map became more granular. Tartaria Oblast, Semirechye, Fergana, Transbaikal, Khalkha banners, Liaoning, Jilin, and the old umbrella term simply had nowhere to fit. Atlas makers, especially in Europe, followed this bureaucratic precision. 19th century cartography began to standardize names in a way earlier centuries had not. Geographical societies in Paris, London, Berlin debated spellings, argued over which local terms should be adopted or replaced, and issued recommendations. Colonial offices published official maps with approved toponyms. Once those names appeared in state-backed atlases, school books, and railway timetables, they hardened. You could still see Chinese Tartary in a title, but the detailed map inside might show Manchuria and Mongolia instead. Over a few decades, this shift in the small print eroded the big label at the top. Tartary had always thrived on imprecision. It was a word for up there somewhere, for a region at a comfortable distance. The closer Europeans looked, the less room there was for it. As soon as you distinguish Siberia from Turkestan, Dzungaria from Mongolia, outer from inner, the old sweeping term starts to look like sloppy shorthand, and in a century obsessed with scientific exactness, especially the kind that could be demonstrated with instruments, coordinates, and tables, sloppy shorthand went out of fashion. Behind this was not just technology, but a deeper intellectual habit. Colonial knowledge systems, whether Russian, British, French, or Qing, developed a strong desire to classify. They built museums, ethnographic societies, statistical committees. They sent out linguists to collect vocabularies, anthropologists to measure skulls, administrators to fill out endless forms. Peoples who had once been lumped together as Tatars or Tartars were sliced into narrower categories: Volga Tatars, Crimean Tatars, Astrakhan Tatars, Siberian Tatars, Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Turkmens, Dungans, various Mongol banners and tribes. Each new category came with its own reported customs, dress, religion, and supposed racial character, written up in reports and articles. This did not mean that the new labels were more true in some absolute sense. They reflected the concerns, biases, and administrative needs of the people doing the classifying. But they did crowd out the older generic term. If an ethnographic atlas of the 1880s could show a rainbow of carefully distinguished groups across Central Eurasia, Tartary as a catch-all became almost an embarrassment, an admission that you had not kept up with the literature. So what does it mean in map history when a label like that disappears? It does not mean the land vanished. It does not mean the people dissolve. It usually means that a broad, fuzzy category has been broken into finer ones, or replaced by terms that better match how some powerful institution wants to describe the world. If you look at atlases across time, you can see this process happen again and again. Scythia fades and is replaced by more specific regions. Christendom shrinks, stretches, and then stops being a political term and becomes almost entirely religious. Guinea, once vast and vague on West African coasts, retreats as Senegal, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, and Nigeria appear. In each case, the disappearance is a rearrangement of vocabulary, driven by new interests, not the erasure of reality. Tartary followed that same pattern. On a late 18th century map, it might span half of Eurasia. On a mid-19th century school map, it might be reduced to a label tucked somewhere above Mongolia. On an early 20th century atlas, it could be gone from the main maps altogether, perhaps surviving only as a historical term in the index. To a historian of cartography, this is expected even ordinary. Words migrate, split, and fall out of use. To someone encountering the maps out of sequence, though, it can feel uncanny. Imagine leafing through a pile of old prints and seeing Great Tartary in one book, Russian Empire and Chinese Tartary in another, Siberia and Central Asia in a later one, and then finally no Tartary at all. If you don't know about surveys, railways, border commissions, and bureaucratic renamings, the change might look like a mystery begging for explanation. In the 19th century, almost nobody saw it that way. They were too busy arguing about tariffs, conscription, and railway routes. For them, replacing Tartary with Siberia or Turkestan was a matter of practical accuracy and imperial pride. Using the newer term signalled that you were informed, that you recognised the latest conquests and administrative schemes. Only later, once those empires had risen and fallen, once their jargon had become just another layer of historical sediment, did the earlier ghost label start to attract a different kind of attention. Old maps do not age evenly. Some stay in institutional collections, annotated and reinterpreted. Others end up in second-hand bookshops, in attics, in frames on the walls of cafes. By the time digital scanners and online archives made it easy for anyone to browse centuries of cartography from a laptop, Tartary had long since left ordinary geography lessons. To an unprepared eye on the internet, the contrast can be jarring. Here is a modern map of Eurasia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China. Here is a map from 1700, Tartaria, sprawled across the centre, with only a few of those familiar names peeking through. The temptation is strong to read that difference as a story of concealment or catastrophe, a great realm that used to be there and was somehow erased. The reality is more prosaic and, in its way, more interesting. 19th century modernization did not hide Tartary. It dissolved the word by knowing the land too well for such a vague label to survive. But in doing so, by pushing Tartary off the main stage and into the margins of old books and antique maps, it accidentally set the stage for something else. It created a gap between what people saw in their everyday atlases and what they might stumble across in older ones. A gap between the language of living geography and the language of archival ghosts. And wherever there is a gap like that, a mystery-shaped outline appears. Later generations would trace that outline with their fingers and ask, what was this place that stretched so far? Why did its name vanish? Were we told the whole story? Those questions floating over the white space between old and new map labels would eventually feed into a very modern legend about a lost empire, a global cover-up, and a vanished civilization called Tartaria. When those questions finally met the internet, they didn't stay quiet. They found comment sections, image boards, video platforms, and endless scrolls of social feeds. And out of that soup of curiosity, confusion, and creativity, the modern Tartaria legend began to take shape. If you wander into that world today, a rough storyline appears pretty quickly. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, not very long ago, there was a gigantic, technologically advanced empire called Tartaria. It stretched across most of northern Eurasia, maybe farther. Some versions say it was centered in Siberia, others in Central Asia, others treat Tartaria as a kind of global federation. This empire, the story says, built much of the grand architecture we see today. Not just in Russia or Kazakhstan, but in Europe, North America, sometimes even Australia. Those monumental buildings with domes, columns, and intricate facades. In the legend, they're not Victorian or Beaux-Arts or neoclassical, they're Tartarian. They belong to a civilization with advanced energy technology, free energy, atmospheric electricity, resonant towers. The antennas on old buildings, the domes, the spires, the strange machines in 19th century engravings are all recast as clues to a lost science. Then comes the turning point. According to this story, something terrible happened in the not-too-distant past. Some say it was a global mud flood that buried entire cities, leaving only the upper floors visible. Others talk about worldwide wars, star forts, mysterious fires, orphan trains. The details vary, but the conclusion is the same. Tartaria was destroyed or conquered, and its memory was deliberately erased. Modern nation-states, churches and universities are cast as collaborators in a vast cover-up. Textbooks lie, maps lie, photographs are misdated. Old buildings are misattributed. The world you were taught in school is only a thin layer pasted over the ruins of a forgotten empire. That's the legend in broad strokes. Different creators emphasize different pieces, remixing them into new combinations. Some keep it relatively local, Tartaria as a suppressed chapter of Russian or Central Asian history. Others go global. Tartaria as the real architect of half the world's cities. It's important to notice what holds all these variations together. Not evidence in the strict historical sense, but a particular emotional logic. The jump from old map label to hidden civilization is not random. It scratches several psychological itches at once. First, there is the appeal of the big secret. Most of us grow up with a sense that the world is larger and stranger than the official stories allow. We hear about classified documents, intelligence agencies, corporate spin, propaganda. We know that governments lie, that textbooks simplify, that powerful institutions can and do shape narratives. So when someone says, look, there used to be a huge empire here called Tartary, and then it vanished from the maps, that idea arrives in fertile soil. It plugs into a pre-existing suspicion. If they lied about some things, what else are they hiding? Second, there is the desire for a grand pattern. Modern history, as taught by specialists, is messy. It's full of local contingencies, overlapping timelines, gradual shifts. Empires grow and shrink. Names change slowly. Borders creep this way and that. For many people, that mess feels unsatisfying. It lacks the drama of a single, sweeping story. The Tartaria legend offers exactly that, a unifying thread that pulls together Russian expansion, Central Asian khanates, Qing frontiers, industrial architecture, and even 19th century orphan policies into one coherent saga. Instead of many small, unrelated processes, you get one big narrative. There was an advanced world order. It was destroyed. Its traces are everywhere, if only you learn how to see them. Third, the modern legend gives its believers a sense of special insight. To accept the conventional account of maps, surveys, and bureaucratic renaming is, in this framing, to be a passive consumer of what they tell you. To notice Tartary on old maps, link it to star forts and domed buildings, reinterpret orphan trains and world's fairs, is to become an active decoder of hidden truths. That's an intoxicating reversal. You go from student to detective, from audience member to protagonist. Online platforms supercharge this transformation. Algorithms on video and social sites are optimized for engagement, not accuracy. They do not care whether Tartaria was a real empire or a shifting European label. They care whether you watch to the end, whether you click the next link, whether you share. And Tartaria content as a genre is very good at keeping people engaged. A creator strings together old engravings, dramatic music, confident narration. They pose questions faster than they can be answered. Why do so many 19th century photos show empty streets? Why are there windows below ground level? Why do we see Tartary on this 1730 map, but not on this 1901? What are these strange towers and domes really for? Each question lands like a small cliffhanger, encouraging you to keep watching or scrolling. The algorithm sees that behavior and learns more of this. So it serves up a second video, then a third, each creator building on the last, adding new interpretations, new finds, new rhetorical flourishes. Remix culture fills in the gaps. A user screenshots a corner of an old map where Great Tartary is written in decorative script. Another crops an image of an elaborate city hall in the United States, focuses on its dome and columns and labels it Tartarian architecture. Someone else grabs an engraving of a 19th century electrical exhibition and circles every wire and insulator as proof of free energy. As these fragments bounce around, they become detached from their original contexts. The map loses its cartouche, its date, its scale bar. The building loses its construction records, architect's name, and city archive. The exhibition loses its catalogue, its technical descriptions, its patent filings. What's left are images that seem to float together in an ahistorical space, available to be reinterpreted in whatever narrative they best support. Selective screenshots of old maps are especially powerful in this environment. If you display a single 17th century map where Tartaria sprawls across Eurasia and you place it next to a modern political map, the contrast is stark. If you don't mention that Tartary was a catch-all for lands beyond detailed European knowledge, or that contemporary texts use the word inconsistently, or that the same region is broken into many smaller labels on other maps from the same period, the image looks like hard proof. Here is the world then. Here is the world now. Something huge is missing in between. Most viewers will not go hunting through digital map libraries to compare dozens of examples. They see the carefully framed pair they are shown. They feel the implied accusation. Why were you never told about this? In that moment, a technical detail of historical cartography becomes, in their mind, evidence of a crime. Into that space step confident narrators. They speak in a tone that does not distinguish clearly between speculation and demonstration. Phrases like "it seems," "maybe," or "one possibility" quietly slide into obviously, clearly, as we can see. Uncertainties are reframed as smoking guns. A missing census? Cover-up. A vague description in a travel account? Censored knowledge. An architectural style that spread globally through imperial influence and pattern books. Proof of a single vanished culture. Historical silence, which to a working historian usually means we don't yet have good sources, is repackaged as they removed the sources. Gaps in the archive, which might be due to fires, neglect, or simply the uneven survival of documents, are read as deliberate erasures. Normal processes of scholarly revision, historians updating interpretations in light of new finds, are cast as evidence that the story keeps changing, therefore it must be fabrication. In reality, there are many genuine uncertainties in the history of Eurasia's interior. There are lost chronicles, unwritten languages, archaeological sites barely surveyed. There are places and periods where we rely on fragmentary accounts from outsiders and scattered local records. For historians, these are invitations to cautious inference, to patient accumulation of evidence, to honest admission of "we're not sure yet." For the modern Tartaria legend, they are something else. Blank spaces that can be filled with imagination and stitched into a single dramatic plot. The legend thrives exactly where specialist knowledge is thinly spread in the general population. Most people have never read a Central Asian gazetteer, a Russian imperial census, a Qing banner register, or an architectural monograph on cast iron facades. They encounter instead a collage of images and confident voices, arranged by algorithms that reward what is gripping, not what is most carefully sourced. In that environment, a ghostly old map label and a sense of unease about modern institutions are enough to support the weight of a global lost empire. And once that structure is built, every ambiguity, every odd photograph, every half-understood term can be slotted into it, reinforcing the pattern. Tartaria becomes less a place and more a lens, a way of seeing the past that turns ordinary historical complexity into evidence of a single vanished civilization and a single deliberate forgetting. If Tartaria is the lens, mud floods are one of the favourite things to look at through it. Spend enough time in those corners of the internet and you'll start noticing the same kind of image, over and over. A handsome old building, high windows, grand doors, and at street level something odd. Doors that open straight into dirt, half-buried arches, basement windows, peering out at the sidewalk like eyes just above water. The narrator pauses, then asks, "Why would anyone build like this? Why would you put windows below the ground? Why does this doorway lead nowhere?" Maybe, they suggest, it wasn't below ground when it was built. Maybe the whole city used to be lower. Maybe something covered it. This is the core of the mudflood narrative. In its more restrained versions, it proposes that there was a massive, relatively recent flood of mud, sometimes framed as the result of liquefaction, sometimes as a mysterious global catastrophe that buried the lower levels of cities all over the world. In its more imaginative forms, it becomes an almost mythic reset event. An empire is destroyed. Its buildings are half swallowed by earth. A new society comes along, inherits the upper floors, and quietly pretends nothing happened. Historical photographs of buried facades are treated as snapshots taken just after the disaster, before the new order finished cleaning up. Old construction drawings get reinterpreted as evidence of pre-flood ground levels. Every bricked-up arch or steeply descending stairway is cast as another fossil from the vanished age. Part of the appeal of this idea is that the visual cues are real. Many cities do have streets where the sidewalk seems to slice across the middle of what once were tall ground floor windows. Basement windows do stare out at ankle height. Doorways do open onto retaining walls or half a flight of steps down. What the legend usually does not mention is that there are much more mundane reasons for this pattern, and they have to do with something far less dramatic than a global mud tsunami, urban redevelopment. For as long as people have been building cities, they have been raising streets. In medieval European towns, you can sometimes see centuries of accumulated street levels stacked like geological layers. Every time a street was repaved, rubble and fill were added. Flood-prone areas built up their quays and waterfronts gradually, lifting the walking surface to keep pace with riverbanks and sea walls. Cellars that were once at ground level slowly became basements, then semi-basements, then completely underground, without any single catastrophic event. In the 19th century, as industrialization and sanitation campaigns took off, some cities did this very deliberately. Chicago is a famous example. In the 1850s and 1860s, engineers there literally jacked up entire blocks of buildings to install sewers and raise the street grid above the swampy ground. Photographs show men turning screwjacks beneath brick hotels and offices, lifting them several feet while business continued above. In other places, instead of lifting the buildings, planners simply brought in fill and raised the street. You can find similar processes in parts of San Francisco, in European port cities, in anywhere that had to cope with flooding, mud, sewage, or changing transport technology. The result, a generation later, looks exactly like what mud flood videos love to show. A handsome 19th century facade with its lower ornament partly buried, a row of half-height windows, a door that now requires descending steps from the sidewalk. None of this requires a single synchronized global disaster. It requires only that cities be messy, layered organisms that constantly rebuild themselves on top of their own debris. The same applies to excavations. When older buildings are demolished or lots are redeveloped, workers sometimes uncover entire streetscapes that were filled in or built over. You see vaults under sidewalks that once served as coal storage. You see older foundations under newer ones. You see a tangle of brick, stone and staircases going nowhere. Frozen in a photograph and stripped of its planning records, that kind of dig can easily be presented as a buried civilization. The key point is that genuine buried worlds do exist in cities, but as products of gradual accumulation, ad hoc engineering, and local decisions, not necessarily as the tomb of a single empire. Tartaria content tends to reverse the logic. Instead of starting from documents about street-raising projects, flood defences or foundation practices, and then looking at the resulting architecture, it starts from the architecture and leaps to a global event. The testimony of city engineers, surveyors, and municipal archives is often ignored or dismissed as part of the cover-up. A similar pattern appears with another favourite motif, orphan trains. Between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, there were in fact organised movements of children by rail in both Europe and North America. In the United States, the most famous version was the orphan train program, run by charities like the Children's Aid Society. From the 1850s to the 1920s, they relocated tens of thousands of children, some true orphans, many simply poor or abandoned, from crowded eastern cities to rural families in the Midwest and beyond. The stated motive was charitable. Give destitute children a chance at a better life, reduce urban misery, spread labour to underpopulated farm regions. The reality was more complicated and often harsh. Record-keeping was spotty. Some children ended up in caring homes, others were effectively used as unpaid labour. There were language barriers, cultural clashes, heartbreaks and abuses. Social historians have spent decades reconstructing this system, drawing on surviving agency records, newspaper accounts, personal letters and later interviews. There is no shortage of tragedy here, no need to embellish. Yet in the Tartaria narrative, orphan trains are often lifted out of this documented context and placed into a very different story. The children become, in some tellings, the last survivors of the destroyed Tartarian civilization, redistributed to populate the new world after the reset. Their lack of family connections is reinterpreted not as a reflection of poverty, disease, and social breakdown in industrial cities, but as evidence that their entire culture had been wiped away. The vague language of some old reports referring simply to street children or foundlings is treated as if it were intentional obfuscation. Again, what is happening is not that people are inventing raw data from nothing. They are borrowing real, painful phenomena and sewing them into a different tapestry. Photographs of children lined up at train stations exist. So do newspaper ads announcing distribution days where rural families could take in a child. Those images carry emotional weight. Paired with the idea of a silenced empire and a purged history, they become potent symbols. The ethical questions around 19th century child migration, questions about consent, class, exploitation, get sidestepped in favour of a grander, cleaner narrative of deliberate population replacement. Mud floods, orphan trains, empty 19th century streets in old photographs, gigantic World's Fair buildings that were later torn down, star-shaped forts with enigmatic plans. Each of these on its own is an interesting historical puzzle. Why were so many streets empty in early photography? Why did cities invest so much in temporary exhibition architecture? Why did military engineers favour those peculiar fortification shapes? Each has answers that historians, architects and specialists have been working through for a long time. Early cameras required long exposure times, so moving crowds often vanished from the plate. World's Fairs served both as propaganda and as laboratories for temporary construction techniques. Star forts emerged from very specific gunpowder-era calculations about fields of fire and defensive angles. But when you're looking through the Tartaria lens, these particular answers become less compelling than the possibility of one answer to everything. Empty streets? Evidence that the city wasn't really inhabited yet after the reset. Temporary fairs? Proof that grand Tartarian buildings already existed and were passed off as exhibitions before being destroyed. Star forts, remnants of a global energy or control grid. The human mind likes patterns. If you already suspect that there was one colossal hidden event, it is tempting to see every oddity as another shard of the same broken statue. The risk is that real, local histories vanish under the weight of the universal explanation. So, how do you separate genuinely intriguing questions from overconfident conclusions? One useful habit is to move sideways before moving up. If you see an image of a half-buried building presented as proof of a worldwide mud flood, ask, are there city plans, building permits, newspaper reports about street works? In many cases, archives will tell you that, yes, that particular street was raised in 1873 after a flood, or that the sewers were installed in a certain decade. If you encounter a striking photograph of children on an orphan train, you can ask, which organisation ran this train? What policies did they follow? What did local papers say about its arrival? The answers may be disturbing: exploitation, class prejudice, cultural erasure, but they will anchor the image in a real web of causes and effects. Another habit is to compare across cases. If a theory claims a single global event, but the physical evidence, the dates of street works, the styles of buildings, the technologies visible in photographs spans many decades and different local conditions, that should give pause. A historian's instinct in such situations is to break the big story into smaller ones, not the other way around. Curiosity doesn't have to die when you step away from the grand unified plot. If anything, it can deepen. The fact that Chicago's streets were raised by coordinated engineering projects is no less astonishing than a sudden mud wave, once you dive into how they did it. The lived experience of children sent west on orphan trains is no less haunting for being embedded in the very visible, very documented anxieties of industrializing societies. The world is full of buried cellars, displaced children, half-understood machines. We do not honour their strangeness by folding them all into a single lost empire. We honour them by letting each mystery keep its own shape, and by accepting that sometimes the answer is not one enormous secret, but many overlapping human-sized stories. When historians look at Tartary claims, they aren't just asking, is this true or false? They're asking, what kind of thing is this, and what kind of evidence would we need to even start answering it? That means beginning with a very particular toolkit. Not special because it belongs to professors, but special because it has to work on people who can't answer questions anymore. The first tool is primary sources, things produced at the time by people who were there. Maps, tax records, court cases, letters, travel diaries, imperial edicts, ship logs, archaeological layers full of broken pottery and animal bones. When someone says, there was a single technologically advanced worldwide Tartarian empire that ruled until the mid-19th century, a historian quietly asks, if that were so, what traces would it leave in primary sources? We'd expect state archives that mention it, not just in one country, but in many. We'd expect treaties between Tartary and Spain, or the Ottoman Empire, or Britain. We'd expect customs records tracking its goods. We'd expect coins, legal systems, calendars, loan contracts, complaints about taxes. We'd expect people arguing about it in pamphlets and sermons, the way they argued about everything else. Instead, what we have are European, Russian, Chinese, Persian, and Ottoman sources that use Tartary as a vague regional label. They talk about particular khans, specific tribes, individual cities. They describe Mongols, Oirats, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Manchus. They argue over who controls which pasture, which caravan route, which fortress. The word Tartary floats above all this as a kind of shorthand, but it never behaves like the name of a unified hidden superstate. That mismatch between what the empire story predicts and what the documents actually show is one of the signals historians pay attention to. The next tool is context. A chronicle doesn't just exist by itself, it belongs to a time, a place, a genre, and an agenda. A 17th century Jesuit in Beijing uses Chinese Tartary differently than a Russian soldier on the Orenburg line. A French mapmaker in Paris is not drawing the world for the same reason as a Qing surveyor in Xinjiang. So historians ask, who wrote this? For whom? Under what pressures? A Russian Tsarist report calling a region Tartaria might be trying to simplify a messy frontier into something a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg can understand. A Chinese gazetteer might write Da Qing, where a French atlas writes Chinese Tartary, simply because one is seeing the world from inside the empire and the other from outside it. Context doesn't make a source good or bad. It just tells you what questions it can answer and which ones it can't. Then there's provenance. Where did this document, this map, this photograph actually come from? Can we trace its chain of custody? If a digital image of an old map appears on a forum with a red circle around the word Tartaria, that's not provenance. Historians want to know which archive holds the original. When was it engraved? Is there a printer's mark? Has anyone published a catalogue of this map series? Sometimes a mysterious map labelled Tartary turns out to be a perfectly ordinary page from a known atlas, copied and recopied by generations of engravers. Errors creep in, names drift, borders get fuzzier. But you can only judge that process if you know where each version came from. Corroboration, finally, is the habit of never being satisfied with just one witness. If an 18th century traveller claims there's a city in Central Asia with 1 million inhabitants, historians ask, do any tax registers, caravan records or local chronicles hint at that size? What does archaeology say about the density of occupation? If a Tartaria video claims a global mud flood in the 1800s, we might look for newspaper accounts of a sudden worldwide catastrophe, tree rings showing simultaneous burial events, engineering reports, insurance records, inventories of damaged property. Instead, what we find are many local floods, many landslides, many municipal engineering projects spread over decades and continents. Lots of mud, but no single date for a single coordinated disaster. Maps are a special case, because they look so authoritative and so global. But a historian doesn't read an old map as if it were a satellite photo. They read it as a document with a job to do. Some maps were navigational tools meant to keep ships off rocks. Some were military documents, emphasizing fortresses and supply lines. Some were showpieces made for royal collections, full of allegorical figures and sea monsters and idealized cities. Knowing the purpose matters. If an atlas labels a huge area Great Tartary, that might simply mean we know there's land here, and we know some of the people Europeans encounter are called Tatars, so we'll stretch that name across the blank. The audience matters too. A map for learned geographers might include careful latitude and longitude. A map for the general public might favour big, romantic, easy-to-read regions, Tartary, Ethiopia, Arabia. The copying process matters as well. Engravers often reused plates. Later printers bought older copper plates, relettered a few names, and turned out new maps that were, in reality, decades behind on frontier changes. Decorative elements, a splendid city squeezed into a coastline vignette, a star fort drawn more beautifully than accurately, might be there to impress, not to report. Reading old maps correctly is partly about learning to see these layers. What was measured? What was guessed? What was decoration? What was stereotype? Without those questions, a label like Tartary can feel like revelation. With them, it shrinks back to what it usually was, a convenient, hazy category hovering over a lot of different peoples. There are some repeated pitfalls that make Tartaria narratives feel compelling at first touch. One is anachronism, reading the past with today's categories. We're used to clear borders and nation-states, so when we see a big labelled region on a 200-year-old map, our brains translate it as country. But early modern cartographers were often mapping spheres of influence, travel zones, language regions, or just the lands of the people we've heard about over there. Another is translation drift. Words travel. Tatar, Tartar, and Tartary slide between languages. Russian sources talk about Tartary in very specific senses. French or English texts mangle that into Tartary. Later readers, working from English only, assume all these terms point to a single fixed thing, when in reality they shifted with time and politics. Even modern translations can flatten nuances. A third pitfall is cherry-picking, looking only at the documents or photographs that support a theory, and ignoring the ones that complicate it. If you collect a folder of images showing half-buried buildings and stop there, you'll feel the mud flood everywhere. If you also collect the engineering reports, the municipal plans, the lawsuits over sewer assessments, the feeling changes. Now those same images are part of a slower, messier story. Historians try, as a professional reflex, to look for the material that doesn't fit what they expect. It's a habit that keeps surprise alive. With Tartary, that habit leads to a mixed answer. There are things we can say with reasonable confidence. We can say that Tartary was for Europeans mostly a catch-all term for the vast northern and central Asian regions inhabited by various Turkic, Mongolic and related peoples. We can say it never functioned, in the sources we have, as the name of a single centralized world empire in the 19th century. We can point to specific polities, the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate, the Kazakh hordes, the Qing conquests in Inner Asia, and trace their rise and fall through legal documents, archaeology, and local chronicles. We can also say that parts of these histories are still blurry. Steppe societies that valued oral tradition over written bureaucracy can be hard to reconstruct. Many archives were destroyed in wars and revolutions. Archaeology in some regions is just beginning. There may be lost cities, forgotten alliances, and technological surprises still buried under the grass. What we don't see so far is the pattern Tartaria videos describe: a globally dominant, technologically superior empire wiped from all but a few maps and buildings within a human lifetime. That absence is not just a missing puzzle piece. It's many, many missing boxes of puzzle pieces, across dozens of cultures that were otherwise very good at recording the things that affected their taxes, their borders, their wars. Living with that kind of answer, partly known, partly unknown, takes a certain calm. It asks you to stay curious without sliding into a rush for certainty. If you like sitting with that feeling, you might also enjoy wandering through longer stories at your own pace. There's a book version of these sleep history journeys available at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount on it. Like this episode, it leans into that quiet space where questions can be interesting even when the answers are incomplete. When you approach Tartary or any big historical mystery with this mindset, the world doesn't get flatter, it gets deeper. Old maps stop being secret blueprints and become conversations between distant ages. Buried buildings become entry points into urban engineering and local politics. Children on trains stop being props in a cosmic reset and return to being children whose lives left traces across parish registers, court records, and family stories. You don't have to choose between wonder and evidence. You can let evidence teach you what to wonder at. You can let uncertainty be a kind of lullaby. Yes, there are gaps in our knowledge of the steppe. Yes, there are archives still unopened, languages still understudied, sites still unexcavated. No, that doesn't automatically mean a lost global empire. It means there is room for careful, patient work, room for surprises that don't have to obey any script, nationalist or conspiratorial. In that sense, history has more in common with sleep than with revelation. You loosen your grip on the neat diagrams of daytime, clear borders, tidy labels, big invisible hands pulling strings, and let yourself drift into something more layered, more ambiguous, more human. On the far side of Tartary, what we find is not a single erased civilization, but a whole tangle of peoples whose stories overlap, conflict, and sometimes vanish into the dust. The task is not to replace them with one grand narrative, but to listen for their many small ones. So what, in the end, was Tartary? Not a secret empire. Not a single civilization with one flag and one capital, and one hidden technology. Tartary was a word, a big, baggy, imprecise word that Europeans used when they looked toward the enormous spaces of Inner Asia and said, more or less, everything out there. The lands of those people we call Tatars. It was a verbal shrug stretched across thousands of miles. Behind that word, the reality was crowded. There were grasslands and deserts and forest belts. There were oases with irrigation systems so old no one quite remembered who dug the first channels. There were trading towns at river crossings where caravans swapped silks, furs, tea, horses, slaves, silver stories. There were confederations of clans that sometimes behaved like states, and sometimes dissolved in a season. There were Buddhist monasteries, Sufi lodges, shamanic rituals held under open sky. There were Mongols and Kazakhs and Nogais and Bashkirs and Uzbeks and Turkmens and Kyrgyz and Buryats and Dungans and so many more, speaking related but distinct languages, making their own alliances, fighting their own wars. For a Jesuit in Beijing, all of that might become Chinese Tartary. For a French mapmaker in Paris, it was Great Tartary. For a Russian clerk in Tobolsk, it was a column in a tax register listing which Yasek-paying Tatars owed fur tribute this year. The umbrella term was simple. The world under it was not. That more than anything is what Tartary really signals, the limits of one group's knowledge about another. It's a fossil of ignorance, a trace of what Europeans didn't yet see clearly, or didn't care to distinguish. And this is part of why the story still pulls at people now. When you follow the label Tartary across old maps and atlases, you are watching information move. A 16th century chart copies a name from a traveller's tale. A 17th century atlas stretches it over a blank interior because no one from that publishing house has been there. An 18th century surveyor sends back more precise toponyms. Siberia, Jungaria, Turkestan, and slowly, reprint by reprint, the big cloud word frays and shrinks, and finally disappears. You can almost feel the channels of news and rumour and measurement tightening. Letters from embassies, intelligence reports, trade statistics, missionary reports about which monastery sits on which river bend. Bit by bit, Tartary gets replaced with finer-grained names. The vanishing of the word is a map of how the world's information systems hardened, how guesses turned into gazetteers, how oceans of somewhere over there condensed into coordinates and cadastral plans. The legend that grows around Tartaria today is reacting, in its own way, to that hardening. When someone says they erased an entire empire, they're not just talking about maps. They're talking about a feeling that the official story is too smooth, that the world got catalogued too quickly, too neatly, that there must be a missing layer no one told them about. Underneath the YouTube thumbnails and the red circles on old engravings, there are quieter questions. Who gets to tell the past? Why do some places show up in schoolbooks and others don't? Why do some ruins feel like they belong to us, and others feel like they were taken away? In that sense, Tartaria is less a theory about the 19th century and more a symptom of now. It appears in a time when trust in institutions is strained, when people see real examples of censorship, propaganda and spin, and then look backward and wonder, if they're not honest with us today, why should we believe them about yesterday? Conspiracy stories offer an answer that feels emotionally tidy. They lied about everything. Here is the real empire, the real catastrophe, the real reset. It's a story that turns confusion into a simple pattern. It gives you villains, victims, and a role for yourself as the one who finally sees through the fog. But the real history behind the label Tartary is stranger, and, in a quiet way, more moving. It's not a tale of one grand civilization erased. It's the story of many different societies whose traces are uneven. Nomad confederations that carried their wealth in herds and textiles, not marble and stone. Oasis towns whose archives burned in wars or rotted in damp basements. Minorities whose languages were never given printing presses, whose oral epics lived in memory and song instead of codified law codes. Their past is harder to see not because a global committee conspired to hide it, but because power, literacy, climate, and chance never favoured them in the same way they favoured, say, London or Paris. Recognizing that does something subtle. It shifts the feeling from "they stole my lost empire" to "we haven't listened carefully enough to other people's histories." It takes the restless energy that wants a giant hidden Tartaria and turns it toward real, still understudied worlds. The routes Tatar horsemen rode, when they brought news across Eurasia faster than any post could manage. The ways Kazakh and Kyrgyz lineages remembered their genealogies generation after generation, without bound volumes, a blend of Persian, Turkic and Russian architecture in steppe cities that grew and collapsed and grew again along caravan tracks. You don't have to believe in a suppressed super-civilization to find wonder in the steppe. The wonder is already there, in the actual archaeology, the languages, the music, the legal codes scratched on wood or leather, the tales about how a certain hill got its name. It's there in the fact that a rider could, for centuries, start in what is now Ukraine and, changing horses and languages along the way, reach the gates of Beijing travelling mostly through society's Europeans, dismissed with one word: Tartary. If you let that sink in, the maps stop being proof of erasure and become invitations. Blank spaces invite you to imagine how partial our knowledge still is. Obsolete labels invite you to ask, who lived under this word? What did they call themselves? What did they care about? Those questions don't lead to a single, simple answer. They lead to a web, to Kazakh oral historians, Qing bannermen, Russian Cossacks, Sufi poets in Bukhara, Buddhist monks in Khalkha, Mongolia, Manchu officials debating how to classify new subjects on the frontier. It's messier than a hidden empire, but it's also more human. And it's not finished. Even now, new excavations in the Kazakh steppe, new readings of Manchu and Chagatai documents, new collaborations with local historians are filling in parts of that web. The real secret, if there is one, is that the past is never fully mapped. No matter how many atlases you print, as this story winds down and you drift towards sleep, you might let that be a calming thought. The world is older and more complicated than any one narrative, official or conspiratorial. You are allowed to be curious without rushing for a single master key. If you've enjoyed wandering through Tartary's shadows tonight, you might also like going further back into the deep prehistory that shaped all of us. There's a book of these long, quiet history journeys full of prehistoric secrets and slow-burn stories waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. You can read more about it there, and if you'd like, pick up a copy to explore when you're awake. For now, if this helped you relax, it would mean a lot if you gently tap like, subscribes so you don't miss future nights like this, and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. Part of the joy of these tales about faraway places is knowing they're drifting through the dark to bedrooms and couches and night shifts all over the map. Tartary, in the end, was a name people once used for lands they didn't fully know. We don't have to inherit their vagueness. We can keep the sense of distance and mystery, but fill it with detail, humility, and care. Let the old word fade. Let the real steppe world, no less vast, no less strange, take its place in your imagination. A place not of erased empires, but of countless small histories still whispering under the grass, patient as sleep.